All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a real special treat. So I know Scott Gruno is going to enjoy this one, but it's a show on Marian Apparitions, a topic I've never covered before, but one that I'm really, really interested in going over the evidence for and against. So one of our guests, Caleb Jackson, has done a lot of research in this area. I'm assuming he's going to be arguing the pro case, or at the very least presenting some of the pro side opinions. He's just setting up his camera, so hopefully he should be joining us any minute now. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead with Kevin. Now, what's your name? Because your name is no longer Kevin Nontradicath. So
you want to hear a short little story? It's so Dale, I have a question for you. When you hear Nontradicath, do you think, oh, he's definitely a Catholic?
So I just hear that you're not a traditional Catholic. So that could imply that maybe you're some not, especially because now I know there are different groups of Catholics. Like I can see his point, but I just never cared about names like that on my end. But yeah,
I never meant it to be misleading, but for the audience, there's a large Catholic content creator who thought that Nontradicath was misleading because some people were going to see my name and think that I'm Catholic, just not a traditionalist Catholic. And so in the spirit of just being not misleading, like not even in the slightest, like personally, I didn't think that Nontradicath was like misleading, but in the spirit of doing everything I can to be as non-misleading as possible, I changed my name. So I just changed the name of my channel to Kevigin of Alexandria, kind of like Origin. So close, Scott. So Origin of Alexandria is a 2nd century Christian heretic.
yeah.
So at later church councils, he was branded as anathema for a lot of reasons, but one of which are like he wasn't, but he was like a proto universalist kind of. And so he had these kind of Gnostic leanings. He legitimately did. But I figure if I name myself, with a play on Origin of Alexandria, and Origin is like the first, well, not the first, but one of the first like public heretics, like nobody can be, that's definitely not misleading because I'm, cards on the table, right? I'm naming myself after a heretic. So I'm Kevigin of Alexandria. If you call me Kevin Nontradic, honestly, I just plan on going by Kevin for the most part now. Like, I don't think it really matters.
I'm just that guy, Kevin. So, all right, cool.
Yeah, people know me. I'm Kevin. That's fine.
There we go. Oh, look at this. Better late than never. We have Caleb Jackson. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, Caleb.
What's up? I like the cat. I didn't know that we were having another guest. Nice.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Molly's actually going to be leading tonight's discussion. Yeah.
Nice.
He is literally the brains behind Kevin there. So,
yeah, true.
So yeah, Caleb, guess what? You haven't missed anything. We just kind of went through an intro with Kevin and stuff, but yeah, Kevin, I'll let you kind of finish. Do you want to just anything else about your introduction and stuff like that for the audience? Or?
I think that's enough about the name change. I guess what I'll do now, if it's cool with you, is I'll introduce kind of Marian Apparitions, why we're talking about them, and I guess like why they matter.
Okay. Well, just before we get into the topic, I just want Caleb to have a chance.
Good point.
Give a general introduction. So, Caleb, welcome back to the show. I hope you're well on your end.
Thank you. Yes, when I'm able to get my screen working, I'm doing well. Yeah, I mean, I've been on Dale's show plenty of times. I've been on Kevin's show once, but yeah, I'm Caleb. I'm a friend of Dale's. Currently working on big research project on miracles now for the last few years. So. Sort of an area that overlaps with what we're discussing tonight. So looking forward to talking about it.
Excellent. Yeah. Me and Caleb, the last time we were on a show together, we were actually going over some of the Marian apparitions. So this is perfect, a perfect fit there. So, all right.
Which apparitions were you going over?
The one in Egypt we were talking about. You know which one I'm talking about?
It's about Zaytun.
So, yeah. So Zaytun is actually not in my slide deck today, and I know next to nothing about Zaytun because it's actually not a Catholic apparition, and a lot of Catholics like to claim it, but it's an Orthodox apparition.
It's the coolest one. Of course, they want to claim it.
I think there's a real argument to be made. I think that Fatima and Zaytun have been duking it out ever since Zaytun. but yeah, I understand the wanting to claim it, but it's an Orthodox apparition for sure.
Gotcha. All right. So, yeah, without further ado, we can get into the presentation. Now, Kevin, just how do you want me to format this? Like, if you set it up in parts, like to present a little bit, and then you and Caleb go back and forth, or do you want just Caleb to come in whenever he has a question or comment? Or
So I do have it it's like segment by segment. So I actually have 6 different apparitions, and I'm going to try to keep it higher level. Just kind of hit on the main points, and then at the end of each one, I'd be interested to see if Caleb agrees or disagrees. I have a feeling that Caleb and I are going to do a lot more agreeing than the bloodthirsty audience might hope that we do. I'm just kidding about the audience, of course. But especially, like, I almost structured it in a way where I think big agreement up front, maybe less agreement as we get further on. But I will be interested to get even just like a quick, affirm or, agree, disagree from Caleb. Even on the first view, that might be kind of fun. So I will pause and ask for Caleb's input.
I'll be taking notes. That's
okay.
Look, yeah, there we go. So keep track of it.
Cool.
All right.
Cool.
Well, with that said, I will bring up your presentation there, Kevin, and go ahead and take it away for the first segment.
Thanks. So while we're on the title screen here, I just want to talk very briefly why we're even talking about Marian apparitions in the first place. And I'll kind of share a personal story. So I grew up at a church called Our Lady of Fatima Chapel. Naming a Catholic church after a Marian apparition is like super, super common. In fact, while I was doing the research, not the research, the research was done, but while I was like kind of gathering my research for this slide deck, I included Our Lady of La Salette in here. And every time that I Googled Our Lady of La Salette, the local Catholic church called Our Lady of La Salette Chapel kept on coming up instead of the actual apparition. So these apparitions are like a kind of a big deal in Catholic culture. They're part of the Catholic stories that, I heard as a kid growing up. Grant, I grew up a little different, I know, than a lot of Catholics. But Marian apparitions are a big deal in Catholic culture. And they're also kind of a big deal in apologetics, sometimes, depending on which apologist you're talking to. But Catholic v. Protestant apologetics, oftentimes Mary comes up. On the Protestant side, they'll say things like, well, we don't really see veneration of Mary in the church fathers and stuff like that. And the Catholics would be like, oh yeah, then explain all these Marian apparitions. Obviously, I'm way oversimplifying here, but Marian apparitions are a big deal. So I would love to shed some light on Marian apparitions. And broadly speaking, I am skeptical of Marian apparitions. We'll get into why. And I'll be interested to see where Caleb and I disagree. And if I was a betting man, I'm going to bet that we wind up doing more agreeing than disagreeing. I could see that my table of contents got a little bit screwed up on the spacing here. Don't know how that happened. That's okay. But you can see that we're going to go over 6 Marian apparitions today. And I set them up in chronological order, and I did that for a reason. We're going to get into that. But we're going to start with Our Lady of the Rosary, then Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Lourdes, and Our Lady of Fatima. First, though, we're going to start with some general notes. These are kind of the themes that I want to pay attention to. Those themes are, as with most things, historicity gets better as time goes on. What do I mean by historicity? Well, if you looked at those dates on the first slide, the dates were kind of, more or less all over the place. I mean, the earliest apparition that we're going to look at is from the very beginning of the 13th century, and then we're going all the way to the 20th century. So we're talking about a span of over 700 years are represented in these various Marian apparitions. And probably unsurprisingly, the historicity is not the same for each of these 6 that we're going to be looking at over these 700 years. Obviously, the 19th century apparitions are going to have better historicity than the 13th century apparitions. I'm kind of drawing a dividing line right around like the, 17th or 18th century, where all of a sudden I think that the historicity actually gets a lot better. And I think that anything before like the 17th century, the historicity is rather questionable. We'll get into the details with the historicity specifically, but I want you to pay attention to historicity as we go through time discussing the history of Marian apparitions. Another theme that I think is worth paying attention to is the theology. Some apparitions have, and I put quotes around this, questionable theology. Okay, who am I to be saying what is questionable theology and what's not questionable theology, right? I'm the only non-Christian on the stream. So me telling you guys what's questionable theology, that's a little rich, isn't it, Kevin? Fair enough. It is a little bit rich. But let me show you the theology, and then I'll let you be the judge. And I have a feeling that you'll agree that it's questionable at best. In particular here, I'm thinking about the scapular, which is associated with Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And I'm also thinking about the end time prophecies of Our Lady of La Salette. And in fact, those, I don't think you even need to be a Christian to see that they're a little bit wrong. Lastly, I'd like to talk about evidence as a theme. I want you to pay attention to, are the only people who saw these apparitions the seers themselves? Were there crowds? If there were, what did the crowds see? How reliable are the seers? Were the seers canonized? Were there any miracles associated with the apparition? Unsurprisingly, this is going to vary greatly from apparition to apparition.
Okay. Kevin, I just had one quick question. So
Sure.
I know that you gave the examples in chronological order. Is that list that you gave, is that exhaustive? Like, does that cover?
Oh, no.
No. Okay.
No. So, notable apparitions that I'm omitting are, and this is just off the top of my head, Our Lady of Knock, Our Lady of Akita, Our Lady of Good Counsel, Our Lady of Garbandel, which has not been approved yet because of how recent it is and also problematic it is. Oh, and let's not forget Our Lady of the Pillar, an apparition that supposedly took place in the year like 40 AD.
It's the very first one, yeah. While she was still alive, so it would have been a biolocation, not a Marian apparition in the traditional sense.
Correct. Speaking of historicity, how long do you think it took for the world to know about Our Lady of the Pillar?
Quite a long time. Do you know that's? We don't get trouble. You know that's the one that the miracle colonnade that I've done quite a lot of research on is associated with the Lady of the Pillar, right? So,
really?
Yeah. So I might.
Oh, the limb.
Yes, the amputee one.
Yes.
Yeah. The one time people are like, why doesn't God heal amputees? It's like, well, here's like the one instance where it's like you can find some record of it, right? It wasn't anywhere near the time of the Lady of the Pillar, like the apparition happened, granted. But
the healing was the 17th century?
Yes.
And Our Lady of the Pillar supposedly occurred in the 1st century.
Correct, but it happened at the chapel that was dedicated to the Lady of the Pillar in the city where she was the patron saint, so it was attributed to her. When it
right.
Happened. Yes.
But the first mention of Our Lady of the Pillar is from the 11th century?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Something like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's 1,000 years that go by and nobody knows about Our Lady of the Pillar. And then all of a sudden there's a church in Spain and everyone's like, guys, Our Lady appeared here 1,000 years ago. And everyone's like, of course.
I'm also surprised you don't have Medjugorje up there just because it's so well known. I know that's very controversial in terms of it hasn't even been approved yet in the Pope.
Correct.
Like it.
That's why it's not here.
It's pretty well known. Yeah.
Yeah. Because
is that the selection you've got here? You've selected like the best, I guess, that they've got evidentially, or why did you select just these ones?
So I included Our Lady of Fatima, which I view as the best Catholic Marian apparition. Notice I said Catholic, which means I'm excluding Zaytun. I think that Our Lady of Fatima is by far and away if there was one apparition that was going to make me go like, oh wow, maybe there is something to all these, it would be Fatima. I'll explain to you why I don't think that that's the case when we get to that slide, but I think that Fatima is the best. I think that Our Lady of Rosary and Our Lady of Mount Carmel are really bad, and I think that everybody knows that they're really bad, and it's like an open secret that they're just ahistorical. We'll get there. So I kind of went from really bad and really old to really good and really recent.
So you could have put. Yeah, I know you mentioned Knock. There's also we don't have to go through everyone that you didn't include, right? But there's Burang, which was in Belgium as well, mid 20th century. So a couple other ones that have interesting elements to them. But I'll let you go ahead and finish.
Yeah, when Dale said, "Did you include all of them?" No, not even close.
I think there's 40 approved ones, and then like a couple hundred that are not, or that are like not. It's a whole process they have. But
it depends on what you mean by approval, because I think Vatican approval, there's only like 10 or something like that. But the Vatican didn't get involved in any like 18th century apparitions or something. So local bishop approval was as good as it gets for certain apparitions.
And they also don't, and they recently just changed the rules on that. I don't know if you saw, like a couple months ago. I think they have different categories, and so it's not as so much like they're allowed to approve and say this was a miracle. They're more just saying like there's nothing holding this back. We've looked into it, and it could be a miracle, and there's no reason to doubt, But they're not going to go so far as to say that it is. My guess for that is because if it were to turn out to be a hoax later in the future, they can say back, well, we never dogmatically affirmed it, so it's we weren't proven wrong or something. So
I think that Our Lady of La Salette has something to do with that. We'll get there when we get there, but you'll see what I mean when we get to Our Lady of La Salette. And yeah, I think it's both prudent and frustrating that essentially the highest level of approval now is a nihil obstat, which is a Latin phrase for nothing objectionable. It's prudent because, like you said, the church is pretty much saying like, yeah, guys, we could be wrong. But it's also frustrating because it's like, wait a minute, aren't you guys like the people with the power to like, actually tell us for sure, like
pontificate?
Right. Yeah. Like what's the point of having this governing body that can make these decisions if the body is just going to be like, well, we're not going to make these decisions. Like,
right.
Okay, then thanks for nothing, I guess. But
I mean, they do that with canonization. I mean, nihil obstat there's different degrees of canonization. Nihil obstat is the first phase where they don't find an issue and then they have to have other supporting things. But they do eventually make a dogmatic proclamation. Same within Lourdes, although that's a little bit different. But they're not afraid to do in other contexts. So I don't know why it's with Marian Apparitions they're the most hesitant. It's kind of interesting. That seems how it is. But
I don't want to get bogged down here, but I don't think it has to do with Marian Apparitions specifically. I think it has to do with broader trends of the church. Okay. I think that as time goes on, we will see the church adopt a similar posture about pretty much all issues. Yeah. Like the church is just going to be very hesitant to say that anything ever is supernatural ever.
Right.
That's just my suspicion. We'll see.
Let's go ahead. Let's go. I've interrupted you too much. Let's go ahead with the presentation.
Cool. So those are the themes that I want to pay attention to. And you'll notice that I put like a little, I like to picture ourselves in history. So where are we? We are right at the beginning of the 13th century. The year is 1206 AD. The history of Our Lady of the Rosary is kind of long and complicated. And I'm not going to click through these links, but the slideshow is linked to in the live chat. So if you want to click on it yourself, you can follow along with the slides and you can click on the links that I've embedded in here if you want. I'm not going to click on them, but feel free to live fact check me if you would like. But the history of Our Lady of the Rosary can be found at a website conveniently named theholyrosary.org/rosary history. It's funny because this entire webpage is literally just a copy and paste of a sermon by Saint Louis de Montfort. And this sermon was given around 1710 AD. But anyway, Saint Louis de Montfort tells us the story of Our Lady of the Rosary. And that story is something like this. In 1206 AD, there was a heresy that was just racking Europe. It was awful. So many Christians were falling for this heresy. And so God figured it's time for me to kind of, elect a hero or a champion to destroy this heresy, right? So here comes Saint Dominic. And Our Lady appears to Saint Dominic and gives him the rosary. You could see this picture on the slide on the right that Our Lady is handing beads on a rope to Saint Dominic. And that's the rosary. It's a prayer that Catholics will say, comprised of Hail Marys, All Fathers, Glory Bees, and a couple other prayers thrown in there. But Mary gave Saint Dominic the rosary and said, this is going to be a very powerful tool. You should use it to, kill all the heretics, not kill, but, convert all the heretics and to stop this heresy from spreading. So go preach it and get the people to pray the rosary. So St. Dominic did go preach it and the people did start praying the rosary and the heresy died out and Europe was saved and yay, happy ending. St. Dominic is a saint. We all still pray the rosary to this day. Isn't that a fantastic story? The only problem, and also this story is quite popular. It's been cited in papal encyclicals. So here is a bull. Actually, I think this is a papal bull that Pope Leo XIII promulgated in 1883. And if I blow it up a little bit here, you can see that he's talking about the rosary, which Our Lady gave to Saint Dominic. And I might not read it word for word here, but if you read this, you can see that Pope Leo the 13th is saying, like, he's not saying that it definitely happened, but he's speaking about the story as if it like definitely is history. So Pope Leo the 13th in 1883 definitely thought that this was a real story, that like it was real history and it really happened in history. By the way, I grew up being told this story as if it's real history. It really did happen. But none of it is true. St. Louis de Montfort himself, in that same sermon, that first source, listen to this. The Holy Rosary only retained its first fervor for a century after it was instituted by St. Dominic. After that, it was like a thing, buried and forgotten, until Our Lady told Blessed Alan to revive the former confraternity of the Holy Rosary. So St. Louis de Montfort himself is saying, like, Our Lady came, gave the Rosary to St. Dominic, and St. Dominic used it to great success. And then everybody forgot about it until Blessed Alan, whoever that is, until Blessed Alan kind of like revived the whole Rosary thing. Does this sound a little bit weird to you? Well, it is a little bit weird. And if we read the Catholic Encyclopedia, it reveals something of an open secret. The preaching of this Blessed Alan guy, he was a Dominican named Alan de Roop. He was the first person to suggest that the Rosary was given to St. Dominic. And guys, this is an exact quote, so I'm not being mean to Blessed Alan. This is the Catholic Encyclopedia talking about Blessed Alan. Alan was very earnest and a devout man, but as the highest authorities admit, he was full of delusions and based his revelations on the imaginary testimony of writers that never existed. Advocates of the traditional story have appealed to the memoirs of a certain Luminosi de Oposa, who professed to have heard St. Dominic preach at Bologna, but these memories have long ago been proved to be a forgery. Another piece of evidence, a forgery. Another piece of evidence wasn't even real evidence. It was a pure blunder. This is the Catholic Encyclopedia, a Catholic like source. It has the Nihil Obstat. So the Catholic Church reviewed this and said, yeah, there's nothing objectionable in this. The story just didn't happen. It's the invention of a 15th century Dominican. So this 15th century monk made up a story about a 13th century person, St. Dominic. St. Dominic was a real person. But if you read the contemporary sources, there's no mention of Our Lady appearing to him and handing him the Rosary. Guess what? The Rosary didn't even really exist in its modern form in the 13th century. And the Rosary changed a lot and it grew a lot. So what happened here is we have this guy, Blessed Alan, and Blessed Alan is essentially coming up. He's writing fan fiction he's like writing a fan fiction origin story of his favorite prayer. But this kind of caught on. It became popular. And because of that, the story spread. And then when people started looking into it, and guys, we've known that this is just an ahistorical story for like over 100 years. Like in the early 1900s, people were talking about this. Modern historians unanimously agree that St. Dominic was a real historical person who lived in the 13th century, but that the legends of Our Lady appearing to him and giving him the Rosary are an invention of the 15th century, about 250 years later. Yet I grew up being told this story as if this story were true. If this story is not true, then is it possible that other Marian apparitions are just not historical or problematic in other ways? Well, we'll find out. That was a couple minutes there. Let me pause. Caleb, comments maybe?
Generally, when it comes to the historicity of the event, I would prefer to have sources that are not 250 years later. The first sources being 250 years later of the particular event. So, yeah, I don't know what contention there would be to say that this seems like a later legend.
Well, so to put on my Catholic hat real quick, and I did a whole video on this, which I included the link to it here. It's a 32-minute long deep dive, my video on it. There's a certain priest named Father Calloway who essentially tells the story the way that I heard it growing up. And then he explains how nobody believes that this is a real historical story anymore, but he does. And he says that the devil said, because what happened in between the early 13th century and the mid 15th century, well, the bubonic plague happened like right smack in the middle. So, and what was the bubonic plague other than a demonic attempt and succeeding in destroying the evidence for Our Lady giving the rosary to Saint Dominic? That's literally, I'm not making this up. That is an argument that Father Calloway puts forward. My jaw was on the floor when I heard that. I was like, ooh, wow. So yeah, not a great argument if you ask me. Probably if you ask most people, not including the Vatican, right? Because again, the Catholic Encyclopedia is something that was put together. There were bishops who were like kind of overseeing it, and it ultimately received a nihil obstat. So the Catholic Church, and also like if you go to like the official Dominican website, they will only ever refer to the story of Our Lady giving the rosary to Saint Dominic. Oh, because Saint Dominic's order, they're called the Dominicans. They're named after him. So you can become a Dominican today. Like you can join the Dominicans, and like if you do, you can go onto their website, and their website refers to it as a legend or a myth or a story. And they might say like, oh yeah, it's a legend that we piously believe. It's like a pious myth, and that's all fine and good. But even they kind of tacitly admit, they're like, yeah, we know it didn't happen, but we don't really care. And that's a fine attitude to have. Like, it doesn't matter if it happened or not. The rosary might be a great prayer, even if the origin story is fan fiction.
And just to clarify something, so Blessed Alan in the 15th century, from my understanding, we don't even have a first-hand account from that time from him about this story, right? We have later sources saying he was the one who invented this story. Is that correct?
We do have first-hand accounts from Blessed Alan. Okay. However, all of his accounts are like, so St. Dominic appeared to me in a dream, and he told me that Our Lady appeared to him and gave him the rosary. And you're like, oh, okay. So if you believe that Blessed Alan legitimately, had St. Dominic appear to him and explain the story to him, then great.
Gotcha. Okay. So our earliest sources do 250 years. That's correct. So, okay. All right. Fair enough. Caleb,
yeah. That would be the equivalent of like you and I having a dream today about one of the founding fathers appearing to us, and like the founding fathers explain to me that like George Washington appears to me in a dream tonight and says like, Our Lady appeared to me. And then I publish this story today, and then historians 800 years from now are like looking back at this story. They're like, oh, this Our Lady definitely appeared to George Washington. Like, probably not, right? Because anyway, that's the equivalent. Okay, this next one, we're going to see parallels here because look at the year, 1251 AD. So we moved only half a century. So we went from the beginning of the 13th century to pretty much directly in the middle of the 13th century. This one is Our Lady of Mount Carmel. If you grew up like I did, you going to a Catholic school, you might have received like little printouts like the one that you see on the screen here. This is like, something that maybe like we would be given, like we have to like read this during class or whatever. And there's like a cute little history of, now you'll see that it says the brown scapular on the top. And that's because just like how Our Lady of the Rosary is like, she gave the rosary to Saint Dominic, Our Lady of Mount Carmel gave the brown scapular to Saint Simon Stock. So in the year 1251 in the town of Aylesford in England, Our Lady appeared to Saint Simon Stock, a Carmelite. She handed him a brown woolen scapular and said, "This shall be a privilege for you and for all Carmelites, that anyone dying in this habit shall not suffer eternal fire." In time, the church extended the magnificent privilege to all the laity who are willing to be invested in the brown scapular of the Carmelites and who perpetually wear it. So that's the brown scapular. Right away, alarm bells might be going off, but hold on, let's set off a couple more alarm bells. There are terms and conditions. So you just heard like, hey, if you die wearing this, you don't go to hell. Well, only if you follow the terms and conditions. So there's something called the Sabbatine privilege. And there was a pope in the 1350s or something like that, Pope John the 22nd, and he promulgated a papal bull called Sacratissimo Uti Culmine. And in that papal bull, he said, hey, everybody, you know how Our Lady only promised the scapular promise to the Carmelites? Well, what if you're not a Carmelite? You can still go to heaven if you die wearing the scapular, but you have to fulfill these T's and C's, these terms and conditions. And you can see them on the screen there. So you either have to recite the little office every day, which is a prayer, or you have to observe all of the fasts of the church together with abstaining from meat on Wednesdays and Saturdays, but you need permission from priests. You can say 5 decades of the Rosary every day, or also with the permission from a priest, you can substitute some other work. So those are the terms and conditions. But hey, as long as you die wearing the scapular, having worn it all your life, and you follow all those terms and conditions, you go straight to heaven. Sweet deal, right? I made a little infographic to show you what this looks like. You've died of dysentery. Did you die wearing the scapular? If no, you're on your own, buddy. You're going to heaven, hell, or purgatory based on how you lived your life. There's no help. There's no backup coming. But if you did die wearing the scapular, great. Did you fulfill the T's and C's? If you did, fantastic. You're either going to go right to heaven, or you're only going to go to purgatory until Saturday. The first Saturday after you die, Our Lady herself will descend from heaven into purgatory and yoink you right out of purgatory up to heaven. If you died wearing the scapular without fulfilling the T's and C's, then you still won't go to hell, but Our Lady's not going to yoink you out of purgatory early, so you might be going to purgatory for like a really long time, like thousands of years. Sounds like it's pretty important to follow those T's and C's. Does any of this theologically seem like a little problematic to you? Well, it does to some Catholics. Joe Heschmeyer is a Catholic apologist. He's currently employed by Catholic Answers. He wrote a blog 10 years ago that's you can still find on the internet. And he was not with Catholic Answers at this time. To be honest, I'm not even sure if he was officially Catholic yet or if he was only like in RCIA or something like that. But anyway, he wrote about the Rosary, the scapular promise, and said it seems problematic for a couple of reasons. So number one, the assurance of salvation seems kind of weird. Like, so you're telling me that like you could be a really awful, terrible person, like never pray, never go to mass, you kick a puppy every day. And if you just die wearing the scapular, you go to heaven. That seems like it's a problem. Also, like, wait, are we justified by wearing magic jewelry, or are we justified through our works, or are we justified through Jesus dying on the cross for us? Right? Like that seems problematic too. Also, wait a minute. Isn't it like a bad thing to get yoinked from purgatory early? Isn't the whole point of purgatory that you're going there to be cleansed? So what? Our Lady's just going to yoink you out of purgatory before you're ready to leave? Like, what if you're not clean yet? Like, purgatory is not a punishment, right? It's a cleansing place. So this whole thing just kind of seems theologically problematic, even to Catholics. And worse, this whole thing is a story that was invented in the 17th century, including the papal bull Sacritissimo Uti Culmine. This is the forgery that Joe Heschmeyer alluded to. You can see there kind of in the middle, on the third to bottom line, forged documents highlighted. That's what Joe Heschmeyer is referring to. And it's not just those documents. Take a look at this. This is a copy of a paper called The Origin of the Scapular, a Criticism, published in 1904 in the Irish Ecclesiastical Record, published by a Catholic priest, mind you. And this priest is saying that, this isn't talking about Sacritissimo Uti Culmine. This is talking about the first document that is, that explains the story of the apparition of Our Lady of Mount Carmel to St. Simon Stock. And this document professes to be what it is not. It is grossly inaccurate in names and dates. It was first heard of 300 years after the death of its supposed author. It was brought to light to a person who was very far from being unbiased or disinterested. It was never submitted to any kind of expert criticism, and it disappeared unaccountably when its publication was demanded. This document, by the way, was a document supposedly written by St. Simon Stock's secretary. So all of a sudden, 300 years, so in the 1500s, this document appeared that was supposed to be written by St. Simon Stock's secretary. And St. Simon Stock's secretary is like, oh yeah, these are all the things that happened to St. Simon Stock. Our Lady appeared to him, gave him the scapular, all this good stuff. But then the document disappeared. And there's just this one guy, this Carmelite, who wrote, he's like, oh yeah, I saw this document. It was written by St. Simon Stock's secretary. He explained all this great stuff. And that's the only document that we have, a document that claims that there was another document that never appeared again. So it's possible that that document was just entirely made up. And So we have like secondhand or third-hand testimony that only appeared 300 years after the fact. Ever since 1904, ever since the publication of The Origin of a Scapular or Criticism, historians have unanimously agreed that Our Lady of Mount Carmel is simply not a historical apparition. In conclusion, Our Lady of Mount Carmel is quite similar to Our Lady of the Rosary, in as much as they are both later creations. They are stories that originated hundreds of years after the events supposedly took place, and there is no evidence, no contemporary evidence, to support the historicity of these stories. And this one has theological concerns as well. And I was taught that this was a real story too growing up, even though, just like with the Dominicans, the Carmelites will also kind of give you a tacit admission that like this is a legendary story. Again, linking my deep dive video on it in the description down below. But that was Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And I don't expect Caleb to have a whole lot of disagreement.
Caleb, over to you. And then I have some audience questions after.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But first,
my biggest question is in theological terms, yoink considered to be the actual terminology?
Yes, that is the technical term. Yes.
Okay, great.
It comes from the Latin yoinkus. Yoinkere, actually. It's a verb.
Yeah, to
yoinkere.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, again, I don't really have any strong feelings towards this one. I feel like the trope of Our Lady appearing to someone and then handing them some object or giving them some message is very common, and like having some kind of memento. I know when we get to Guadalupe, that's going to be a theme as well. So it seems like you see a lot of general tropes with these sort of things. I also think the naming of them is just interesting, how they name them after either the location they were at or some symbolism they have, like the Rosary. It's just interesting how they distinguish, them by the categories of Our Lady. And you can pray to a particular version of a Marian apparition. Like you can pray to Our Lady of Fatima or Our Lady of Lourdes, which is like different iterations of the same person. It's kind of strange.
We're going to get to some Our Ladyception. Like, the 2010 Leonardo DiCaprio film Inception?
Yeah.
We're going to get to some Our Ladyception, where it's Our Lady inside of Our Lady inside of our... You'll see. Yeah. We'll get there.
Yeah.
All right. So we do have some people in the audience. So here's from Scott Grunrow. He's kind of saying the devotion occurred around the time when the church was developing its concept of purgatory in the 1200s, presumably. So for more info about medieval interpretations of purgatory, see this source. Now, I just want to say, though, according to you, the first instance of this legend didn't happen until was it the 17th or 18th century?
Like 16th or something. 16th.
Okay, so that would be after purgatory was kind of worked out then, or like what would you make of Scott's point here about purgatory developing at the time?
No, I actually think that Scott might be saying, and Scott, feel free to, Scott's been on my show though. So Scott, feel free to correct me, but I think what Scott might be saying is like the story of Our Lady of Mount Carmel originated in the 15th century, and the 15th century or 16th century, whatever it was, whenever the guy who made up the story was, that's when the doctrine of purgatory was like becoming a thing. I think that's what Scott is saying. And Scott, correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, but
so you're saying purgatory wasn't like a dominant doctrine until the 15th century?
I'm not positive, but that strikes me as about.
Well,
right.
I'm thinking like I'm a big fan of Dante's Divine Comedy. I know he has Purgatorio, and that was published I think 1321. So
That's a good
obviously
point.
there were conceptions, but I think it was like evolving. They didn't have a dogmatically laid out version of what exactly it was. So there were different ideas behind it, perhaps.
Yeah.
One thing just to add here, don't forget, this was what sparked the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther. The greed of springing souls from purgatory by putting the coin into the thing. So maybe that's why the Catholic Church, in response to the Protestants, they had to crystallize their doctrine. So maybe it's okay. All right, fair enough. We also have from Man 1163 saying the purpose of the scapular is to alleviate the monk's scrupulosity. Yet the promise only works if you follow rules. So how is that supposed to be consoling in any way?
Also, what exactly is a scapular? I forgot to ask that as well.
Okay. I'm looking around, but I'm almost positive that I don't have mine anymore. So a scapular, it's funny. A monk like St. Simon Stock would have worn this giant woolen rectangle. Okay. And then another one on the back connected by a little strip of cloth, like a big moccasin, like a smock. You see in the picture of Our Lady holding two little cloth rectangles connected by a string. But you'll notice that the way that I described it, it was like, big enough to cover your whole torso. That clearly in that picture, that does not cover your whole torso. That's what we all wore. And we would wear them under your shirt. And by the way, you can't just go get a scapular. You have to be enrolled in the scapular. There's like this. Actually, I don't know how it works, but a priest has to enroll you in the brown scapular. So I was enrolled in the brown scapular when I was 6 or 7 years old. And I wore mine all the time, including like while I was swimming and stuff like that. I would keep my scapular on for fear of what if I drown and I don't have my scapular on. And that was people would even keep them on in the shower and stuff like that. I admittedly took mine off in the shower, but I would like leave it close to, so like, if I was, if I slipped and hit my head, hopefully as I'm bleeding out, I have the wherewithal to grab my scapular and put it on.
Is it the idea that you don't get, that you get expedited in purgatory if you're wearing it?
You have to die. You have to die with it on. We were also told old wives' tales of stories of like, there was this sinner guy who grew up Catholic, and he stopped caring about Catholicism. So he went and he started living with his girlfriend and he stopped going to mass and all that. But because of his culture, he still kept on his scapular. Well, one day he was riding his motorcycle and he got into a really bad motorcycle accident. And wouldn't you know, the cops found his scapular hanging from the tree. It had got launched off his body when he was dying. And so he's in hell, and sucks to be him, right? I'm not joking. That is an actual story that I was told growing up. Like we would be told all these old wives' tales and stuff like that.
It reminds me a little bit of the Mormon kind of, the magic underwear. I know it's the derogatory term that they use.
Yes.
Like where they wear that. It's kind of similar to that to me in that way. But I mean, look, I have enough gripes as it is theologically with Catholicism. That would be a whole rant. I have always thought it weird that Catholics are very into reliquary. Not just like that's not that I have an issue with that, but they sort of assume that objects, including the Eucharist being the most obvious example, but other things have actual like powers or substantial abilities, right? Like you're actually consuming the flesh of Christ, or holy water can have some kind of ability, or in this case, a scapula, to the point where like merely touching it or having it on you actually makes a difference. Which to me is, I'm not even going to hamper on the faith works versus works thing. Because I grant that works would contribute to it. The arbitrariness of having a particular piece of cloth within a certain metric of your flesh seems so petty and so something that not a all perfectly loving God would do. It seems like a rather arbitrary rule that humans would just make up. At least as I see it.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you at all. But the one thing that I will say is that I don't think that it's a Catholic thing to imbue physical items with supernatural powers and abilities. I think it's a human thing. Like, we see that not just in Catholicism, but like in all the pagan religions, there's always things like that. In a lot, like, the Orthodox have their icons. It's a human thing. I would argue that it's very few. So like, American Protestants don't do the object thing. And then like, maybe there's like some Buddhists who think that like all the material stuff is bad. But like, other than that, magic objects are kind of part of everybody's culture.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, but even in the Bible, you see it a little bit with like Peter's shadow touching people and healing them, or where the woman who's bleeding goes up and touches Jesus and is healed. Like, they're just the emphasis of putting hands on and touching. It's a very physical kind of understanding. Even with Catholic relics, like they take the actual body parts of, like, they'll dig saints up and take a bone or something, and will distribute across churches. And those are like, actually, it's kind of weird that they just sever the head of one person and send it here and the rib of someone else. It's just they put a lot of emphasis on the body parts themselves.
Have you ever held a relic of the true cross?
I have not, but there's about 1,000 different ones, so it's
well, the one that I held was real.
Yeah. I think Luther had a comment where he said there were so many nails from the original cross that you could you could make every horse, you can melt them all down and like make a horse for every horse in Berlin or whatever it was.
I am not joking though. I have held a relic of the true cross, and My grandpa invited us over to like his house because he had it. Like it was like go like, and then he had to mail it off to somebody else, and they had to mail it off to somebody else. But I remember asking my dad because I was old enough to be like, "Is this really a relic of the True Cross?" And my dad kind of explains to me like, "Well, we don't know for sure, Kevin, and
For
it
sure.
might be." Like my dad is devoutly Catholic to this day, traditionalist Catholic, devout. Like, so I'm not saying this story to, but my dad is just a smidge more skeptical than my grandpa. So anyway,
That's fair. I mean, we have like what 3 different heads of John the Baptist. I think my favorite one is that I think we have 3 different foreskins of Jesus apparently. So, pick your relic, I guess. But it's weird.
Mary's breast milk too. We have that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so yeah, last thing on this from Jerry Pollock. It's not a question, but I think he's aiming this at you, Kevin. He was saying, "I would love to see your cooperation with man behind Ascend of Mount Carmel's channel." So I don't know if you know who that is, but
I don't. Sounds like a Catholic content creator though. I'll have to look them up.
okay, all right, well, yeah,
Cool.
So yep, over to you to keep going there.
Okay. And if it's cool with you, I'll do Our Lady of Guadalupe. I'll take like a 2-minute and 59-second break to go feed my cats, and I'll be right back.
Sounds good. Yep.
Perfect. We're going to move forward. You'll notice that we're jumping ahead a couple of centuries. So we were just in the year 1251. We're jumping ahead 300 years to 1531 AD. We're not only jumping through time, but we're also jumping geography. So for the first 2, we were in Europe. We were in Italy and England. Now we're actually in the Americas. So Our Lady of Guadalupe, the story, I'm not going to read this to you word for word, but I did copy and paste this from VaticanNews.com. VaticanNews.com is not actually associated with the Vatican, but they are like a Catholic news agency. So this is the story that you like hear. This is how Catholics tell the story, is what I'm trying to say. So I'm not like embellishing the story or anything, but okay. So in 1531, there is, so we're in Mexico, modern day Mexico, and it's 1531. The Spanish have just shown up and they're kind of converting the natives. Well, there's a native man who his Spanish name was Juan Diego. And Juan Diego was alone up in the mountains, and all of a sudden, Our Lady appears to him. And Our Lady says, "Hey, Juan, I would really like a chapel built to me on this hill, please and thank you. Would you just go tell the bishop to build, tell the bishop I appeared to you, tell him to build a chapel to me. That'd be great, thanks." So Juan Diego's like, "Yeah, great." So he goes and he says, "Hey, Bishop Juan de Zumaraga, I would really love it if you built a chapel to Our Lady on the hill over there because she told me that she wants you to build a chapel to her on that hill over there." And Bishop Juan de Zumaraga is like, "You're crazy. No way. You're just some local peasant guy. There's no way that Our Lady actually appeared to you." So Juan Diego's like, "Oh, geez, what am I going to do?" So he's wandering like on the hill again, as he does. And Our Lady appears to him a second time. And she's like, "So how'd it go?" And Our Lady, the bishop didn't listen to me. He thought I was crazy. So then Our Lady's like, "Oh yeah, watch this. By the way, it's the winter. It's December. Our Lady makes flowers that only bloom in the spring, come up from the ground." And Our Lady says to Juan Diego, "Gather up these flowers and bring them to the bishop. That's going to be your sign to him. It's a miracle that these flowers exist because it's the winter, and he'll know that I sent you now that you have these flowers." So Juan gathers up all these flowers, and he's wearing this big moccasin called a tilma. That's the word for it. And so he kind of grabs the ends of his tilma, and he's holding up his tilma like this. So he's got kind of just like this big, tarp in front of him, and he's just loading it up with flowers. And so he's running with all these flowers, and he goes back to the bishop, and he gets to the bishop, and he says, "Bishop, I've got something to show you." And he drops his tilma, and all the flowers drop to the ground, and the bishop is in awe. And Juan Diego is like, "Our Lady was right. The flowers really made him," it dropped his jaw. It was not the flowers that made his jaw drop. Somehow, the image of Our Lady had been imprinted on the tilma of Juan Diego. And that is the exact tilma that Juan Diego wore right there on the right. That is the picture of Our Lady that was imprinted on Juan Diego's tilma. Bishop Zumarraga saw the image, saw how miraculous the image was. That's fantastic. He builds the church and everybody lives happily ever after. That is the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And by the way, the Basilica at Guadalupe, which is that church that they built, it is the most pilgrimaged site in the Americas. And it's like the third most pilgrimaged site in the world or something like that. I'm like, it's crazy how many people.
Is that Catholic or is that including all religions?
No, I think it's all religions. Do you know the number one most pilgrimage site in the world? It shocked me.
Is it not Mecca?
It is not Mecca.
Is it Rome?
It is not Rome.
I would have thought. I'd heard Guadalupe was like in the top 3. So if that's third, I actually don't remember what the.
Wouldn't Jerusalem be? Because it's got the 3.
It is not Jerusalem. This blew my mind, and it shows you how uncultured I am. It's the River Ganges in India.
Oh, India also has such a big population too.
There's a billion people living.
So does Mexico. Mexico has a huge population too. So that's probably why.
And it's a whole river, which is bigger than just.
Yeah, there's not like a specific spot. It's a lot.
That's true.
So.
Probably easier to make a pilgrimage to the River Ganges. Yeah.
If you're in India,
yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay. I told you the story as I would have heard it growing up. But that's not all of the story. There's also the tilma itself, that image that we still have to this day. So I know that this is like kind of hard to see, but on this screenshot from this website that I've linked there, it says, here's what modern science has to say about the tilma. The image to this day cannot be explained by science. The image shows no sign of deterioration after 450 years. There is no sketch, no sizing, and no protective over varnish on the image. Microscopic examination has revealed that there were no brush strokes. The image seems to increase in size and change color due to an unknown property of the surface. According to Kodak of Mexico, the image is smooth like a photograph. The image has consistently defied exact reproduction by brushstroke or by camera. Several images could be seen reflected in the eyes of the Blessed Virgin. It is believed that those images are Juan Diego, Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, and Juan Gonzalez, the interpreter, as well as others. That's crazy, right? This tilma, it's a scientific wonder. It's like the Shroud of Turin or something. Only problem is I just picked 4. Pretty much all of that stuff is false. But I picked 4, and I'm only going to show you like a few, I think, that like I'm going to demonstrate that they're false. But here is it's just a blog from Skeptical Inquirer, but it links to a Mexican journal article. There was a scientist in Mexico who examined the cloth under a microscope, and he saw brushstrokes. There's brushstrokes. We've known this since 2002. We did this testing in 2002. So it's just not true that there's no brushstrokes. Like there are brushstrokes.
Well, hasn't it been painted over as well? Like I know that they say that the original image apparently they claim is not painted, but the actual one that you see if you go visit the temple has updated with more stars and stuff like that on it.
We'll get there. Get there.
Yeah.
I just want to add, unlike the Shroud of Turin, which was confirmed not to have brushstrokes scientifically, right, Kevin? You'll admit that.
Yeah. So the tilma is not quite on the same level as the shroud. Let's say that
you can't do a photographic image that's going to give you the same kind of effect that you would with the shroud, at least.
Yeah.
If you want to take a look at the eyes, so do you see a man reflected in the eyes here? I know where to look, so I see it.
Can you zoom in even more? I feel like that's still not zooming.
What are we looking for, Kevin? Sorry.
The reflection of the man. It's supposed to be like. Is it supposed to be as if she was alive and was like looking through her eyes? What would be reflecting off of it? Like she's looking at the.
That's what they say, but Dale. Can you zoom in? Because I might have to stop sharing in order for me to zoom in.
Well, I've made it full screen, but that's the best.
Okay.
I've seen other zoomed in pictures in the past. This particular way around here is really hard to see.
I see a figure right in the black pupil part. Like, does he have both his hands up, kind of thing? Like, don't
No,
shoot? No, okay.
no. So
I see it.
there's, and see, this is the hilarious part. This is just about staring at like ink dots, and then until you see something, like, and humans will do that. Humans are really good at pattern recognition. But the image that everybody says that they see is like a man with a mustache. And you can actually see his shoulders. It's kind of like you're seeing him from like here up. But the funny thing is it's right next to the pupil where the iris would be. And like you don't see reflections in people's irises. Like it, so it's just, and not to mention, like, that is not what a human eye looks like when you, like, when there's a reflection in it. Like, that's just not what it looks like.
We also don't know, presumably, what they looked like in terms of Juan Diego and stuff. So, like, how would you confirm that? I mean, I guess that would be the inference, but it's not like we know what they looked like.
Right. But just the whole idea that we're actually seeing reflections, it's preposterous. It's ridiculous. What we are seeing are dots of dye. Like, it's that's not a reflection. And it's very silly. It's just very silly to say that this is a reflection. Oh, hold on. Do I have my slides in a funny order? Yes, I do. Okay. So I'm jumping around a little bit here. Actually, tell you what, I think it's going to go better. So we were talking a little bit earlier about how we do see brushstrokes. Perhaps most damningly for this whole tilma is we've actually found initials in the bottom corner of the tilma, MC. We also have the writings of a certain Fray Sahagun from, he was a monk, like a Spaniard living in Mexico in the 16th century. And he writes about how there's this cult at Tepeyac, which is where Guadalupe is. And they're worshiping this image. But Fray Sahagun talks about how this image was painted yesterday, quote unquote, by the Indian Marcos, MC. Marcos Sipak, the famous 16th century Mexican native artist who also painted this. Do those look kind of similar? I think they kind of do. But what we do know is that whatever we have today has been painted over. So the going theory is that somebody got their hands on a Marcos Sipak painting and then painted over it and turned it into like Our Lady. Like maybe it was legitimately a painting of Our Lady that they like modified, or maybe, because I don't think that's Our Lady. I forget exactly who that's supposed to be in this picture on the left, but it's just, they took some Marcos Sipak painting and they painted over it. And again, we're going to see that the whole mythos around the tilma is kind of like the Rosary, where what we're getting with this apparition is a fan fiction origin story. I don't think that Juan Diego even existed as a historical person. And I'm not alone in thinking this. In the above link, Monsignor Guillermo Schulenberg admitted as such. Who is this Monsignor? So first of all, he's a Monsignor. So he's a high-ranking Catholic official. And is this guy some modernist liberal? No, he's dead now. He was born in 1916. Schulenberg was appointed the abbot of the Basilica of Guadalupe. The second most visited Catholic shrine in the world. Okay, whatever. But he was the abbot of the shrine at Guadalupe from 63 until 96. So for over 30 years. But in 96, he was forced to resign because the canonization process for St. Juan Diego was currently ongoing in 1996. And Schulenberg spoke out against it, saying, we should not be canonizing Juan Diego, because he didn't exist. He wasn't a real person. So he got asked to step down. He got retired.
So, Kevin, are you telling me that Wishbone lied to me when I was a kid in the 90s? He told this story, and he said that this guy was a real person. So can't trust Wishbone, I guess.
You can't. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
But
it hurts, but
I know. But so a 20th century bishop not believing that Juan Diego is a historical person isn't a very good reason for me not to believe that he's a historical person, right? So why don't, it's not just because, like, I'm not just like, hey, whatever Archbishop Schulenberg believes is what I'm going to believe. No. Bishop Zumarraga, who I've mentioned a few times. He's the bishop that Juan Diego showed up to and like brought the roses to and all that. We have a ton of his writings. In fact, Bishop Zumarraga published the first book ever to be published in the West, in the Americas. It's called Doctrina Breve. And so we have a lot of Zumarraga's writings. He never mentions Juan Diego or any kind of apparition. We also have the writings of a whole bunch of these the Spanish monks, like Sahagún. There's another guy whose name I forget, but they all write about an image that the Mexican natives are worshiping. They refer to them as a cult. They actually speak pretty negatively about these natives worshiping this image. But it seems like evidently this image wound up getting placed inside their church. And I guess people kind of like, I don't know, they just like forgot that we used to hate that image. And roughly 100 years go by. And let me see. The earliest record that we have of the life of Saint Juan Diego emerges in 1648. So 1531 is when the apparition was supposed to happen, but the first time that we ever hear about Juan Diego is 1648. The first telling comes from a Spanish translate. So there was a story written in, and I'm going to mispronounce, but like Nahuatl or something like that is the language that the natives would have spoken at that time. And in 1648, a priest named Miguel Sanchez translates this story from Nahuatl into Spanish. And it's nothing much. It's just like, hey, Saint Juan Diego, like he was this guy, and that's it. And so the contemporary evidence for Juan Diego just doesn't exist. And the evidence that we do have from the contemporaries is quite negative about the Tilma of Guadalupe. And then perhaps most damningly, we think that this was painted by Marcos Sipak. And there's that image again. So in summary, we have a legend from 100 years after the event supposedly occurred about a miraculous tilma that turns out to not be miraculous. It seems like the legend of Juan Diego is just a legend that grew over time to explain a relic that a church in Mexico had, and eventually the legend grew so popular that Juan Diego was canonized. And so I have two different videos, one just on the tilma itself, like the science of it, and then one on why I think that the canonization of Juan Diego is actually like a big problem for the Catholic Church.
Did they end up canonizing him?
Yeah, he's a saint. Yeah. He was canonized in like 2000 or something like that, or like 2001. In my lifetime, he was canonized, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, so he's a saint.
I was going to say, I was going to make a joke that has anyone said that the MC could be Mary initialing herself as Mary Christ? I mean,
that'd be so funny.
That's an alternative possibility, right?
Yeah, Jesus Christ, the son of Mary Christ. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I like that.
Joke by Bart Ehrman, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
I'm sure, I know Dale knows more about the tilma particularly than I probably do, because I think people draw comparisons for obvious reasons between this and the shroud, even though probably for Dale, this is a good example of a control group, because he can contrast to say, well, look, here's how we can show the tilma is fake, and this doesn't apply to the shroud in the same way that it would to the tilma. So you kind of have what we would expect the shroud to be more like if it were fake, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I looked into this because Michael Lofton brought it up and asked me to, like, what do I think when I was on his show talking about the shroud and stuff. So I went back and looked at it as a compare and contrast type thing. And it's really is night and day. Like, I think Kevin got into it. There have been some scientific studies or alleged scientific studies, but as it really kind of reduces down to, I think I see. And I think it's kind of pareidolia. And there are. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I haven't spent a lot of time looking into this, but when I did, it's really hard to find the original published studies. Most of it, when you look it up, is just blog articles who make these claims and don't give citations.
There are no peer-reviewed journals for.
I think that there was one from the 70s, if I remember because I remember Joe Nickell did an article in the 80s, which I know Joe Nickell's kind of sketchy when it comes to credibility on some of this stuff, but he did have some citations from earlier stuff that was published. I think a lot of it was published in Spanish though, so it's harder to find. I have heard one claim, and I think it's probably just as bogus as the other ones made, where it was like there was one scientist or doctor who went up and had a stethoscope and could hear like a pulse or the heart or something as if it was like alive. I have no idea where that comes from. I'm guessing it's probably just a legend and is not off of that. But I think a lot of the claims are just kind of ridiculous, as we said, and just some of them are just flat out not true.
There is something. So Kevin's just feeding his cats. He'll be back
Right.
in a couple minutes. But I'll ask Kevin because I don't think he covered the fact that I think with this image, there's allegedly like a hidden musical song involved in this.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's kind of a miraculous musical image. So I remember, I'll have Kevin kind of explain the details because I kind of forget about it now. But so there's a whole bunch of claims, but from my knowledge, there is no credible peer-reviewed studies with that one possible exception from the 1970s. But I've never heard of that one.
And that could be, I'm pretty sure that it exists, but that could also be like a false memory. But I'm pretty confident that I remember reading Nickel having an article in the late 80s where he has it, and I looked at the works cited and he mentioned some stuff, but I'd have to go look at it because I couldn't say that with a high degree of confidence.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's I don't know what.
But I don't think that they're completely. I don't think most of those are like completely made up, from what I can tell. I think a lot of them are based off of studies that were much more modest and less impressive, and then were completely blown over in terms of like what was claimed or something, from what I can tell.
Yeah. The point that I kind of wanted to make is that a lot of it, what I've seen, is kind of like reduces down to I think I see-ism, right? Like, oh, I think I see this in the eyes and stuff, and these are supposedly called studies. Not in shroud studies, there are things like that. So a lot, like with Alan Wanger, for example, I think a lot of what he said, or others claim they see teeth on the shroud, but I kind of think that's pareidolia as well. Like it's kind of, we're seeing what we want in it and stuff, right? We can't really. There are these things here. Nice.
Right. Yeah, fine.
All right. So
maybe that was Mary upset that we were bashing her Tilma, and she did that.
Mary Christ, yeah.
Right.
Oh, so Kevin's back. So Kevin, I was just telling Caleb that I think you missed going over. Isn't there some kind of hidden music in this image? So what's that about? Is that credible or?
So no, it is not. I skipped a lot of stuff just for the sake of time, but the music thing is particularly funny. So the claim is that, look at the image. You see the stars on Mary's cloak. So not only, apparently the stars are exactly in the sky the way that they would be on December, whatever, 1531, if you were viewing them from Mexico City, Mexico, or whatever, which is nonsense. But additionally, they make music, quote unquote, if you, and this is hilarious. So if you just Google Guadalupe music, you will hear a choir singing what sounds like very heavenly music. How did they come up with that? Well, if you just listen to the pious stories, it's just the stars. It's music. Not so. Take a look at the stars. Now imagine drawing a grid on them and just kind of setting up the grid however you want, and then assigning different keys on a piano, but all different keys on the piano that are within the key of C major. And then you're just kind of like, oh, like, okay, like this star fits into this grid and this one fits into this one. And then you almost play it like it's a tab where you're reading from like the bottom to the top. And so you just play the keys on the piano and you're just assuming equal timing. So like there's no tempo to this. But then when you listen to the recording, there is like not each note is held equally as long as the other one. So literally like the entire rhythm is just added on top of it. And just the note selection itself is entirely arbitrary. Like you could literally take any scattering of any dots and do what you did there, and it would come out sounding good because you're allowed to play with it. So I tried to keep that music theory light, but yeah.
I just Scott says sorry, Caleb, the musical connection in the Tilma ties into Renaissance notions of music of the spheres. So that's interesting. And last thing, Caleb, I'll let you come back. But the other Philip says it's a popular phrase that to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. So I hear this all the time from the Orthodox on Faith Unaltered. But as a historian, he's saying, I know that oral traditions are just legends until evidence and data can support their legitimacy. So just wanted to phrase, because he's a historian there. So yeah, Caleb, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, so the one thing that and Kevin, correct me if this isn't correct, but as far from the little research I have done, the one claim that I did look at that it doesn't seem like it's bogus, that actually does have some merit, and that's sort of touted as a miracle. I don't think it's as impressive, is that, Kevin, are you aware that there's a claim that in the 1920s there was a terrorist attack where someone planted a bomb, or I think it was a stick of dynamite, in a wreath of flowers during a chapel service, and exploded and damaged much of the chapel right in front of the tilma, but the tilma was unscathed. There was a cross in front of it that was bent and melted, and they have that displayed in the chapel. Actually, I think I have a picture of this. Hold on. And they have it displayed there, and they see it as like, oh, Christ laying down his life for his mother or something like that to protect her. But the miracle, quote unquote, is that the image was never burned or scathed despite doing it. If you can see that at all, that's the aftermath of it. You can see the knockdown stuff, the burnt marks, and then you have this up there. But I think the frame was damaged, but the actual tilma within it was not. Now, you could just say that's sort of coincidence, given that it would have been a relatively small blast because the flowers are blocking it. That I don't think it requires a miracle to say that like had to be divine intervention. You could just say that got lucky with the placement of it or something. But as far as I can tell, that story isn't like made up. I think that probably did happen from what I can tell.
I believe you're right. One thing that I will add that I didn't put in my slides is that some people will say that like the average tilma is made of cactus fibers, and so it should have disintegrated even under the best conditions within 100 years of its weaving. And here we are 500 years later, and the tilma is still in one piece. That's because it's not actually a tilma. It's a canvas. Scientists have actually like analyzed what the tilma is made out of, and it's just not made out of cactus fibers. It's essentially hemp paper. So like it's like what the Declaration of Independence is written on, which is considerably less degradable than cactus fiber. So some of the claims of the tilma like miraculously surviving this long are inflated. Oh, and by the way, the tilma is way too large to be a tilma.
I was gonna say it looks way too. When I see pictures like people like it's supposed to be something someone wore like on the inside, it looks way too big.
That would only be the front of it.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
That's only where the flowers were. It's way too large. People have done the math, and Juan Diego would have had to be like 8 feet taller or something like that for the size of a tilma to make sense.
Or just had really oversized clothes because they were hand-me-downs. So maybe he just couldn't find it.
Yeah.
So his dad was Michael Jordan or something like that.
Yeah. Despite the fact of, like a native person being, born in the 16th century or whatever, would have been 5'6" or something, like it wouldn't have been a huge guy.
All right. And Guillermo is just kind of confirming that the sanctification of Juan Diego, they used a forgery for proving the historicity of Diego. So
so that's the Codex Escalada. I'm not positive that it's a forgery, although I lean in the direction of it being a forgery. What I will say is this. During the canonization process, a lot of Catholics were saying, like, man, wouldn't it be convenient if we actually had contemporaneous documentation of the life of St. Juan Diego? Because we don't have any, and that kind of sucks. And then all of a sudden, during the canonization process, an anonymous donor gives them essentially a death certificate, hilariously signed by like Bishop Zumarraga and Fray Sahagún or something like that, the guy who was very critical of the tilma. And historians have said that would be like, imagine us today producing, like, Paul Bunyan, like Paul Bunyan's not a real historical person. Well, imagine today the church was trying to canonize Paul Bunyan, and then an anonymous donor gave Paul Bunyan's death certificate to the church, and Paul Bunyan's death certificate was signed by Abraham Lincoln. You'd be like, wait a minute, that's a little weird. And that's what the Codex Escalada is. But the one reason why I say I don't know is they hired a professional signature expert guy, and they compared the signatures of like Frey Sahagun or whatever from the authentic letters to this death certificate. And they're like, that does look like his real signature. So I don't know. Proposed ideas have been things like we think that somebody took a blank piece of paper that Frey Sahagun signed, and then they turned it into a death certificate of Juan Diego. Like, that's possible. I don't know. But the fact that some expert said, like, no, this signature checks out, that's the only thing that gives me pause.
Gotcha.
Last thing I'll say about this before we move on, this is more just funny about that. My favorite story about the tilma is that there's some random when I was looking through them, there's some random picture of Hillary Clinton visiting that in 2009, and they're like, I think it was when she's secretary, and they're showing her around, and they show her the tilma. Let's see if I can find it. And from what I can tell, she didn't have any idea of like the history behind this. So she's like, "Oh, that's a pretty painting. Who painted that?" And they tell her God, and she just like, and then it's like, okay. Well, let me see if I can do it. I just think it's really funny. You see that looking at that, it's like, oh, that's a cool painting. Where did that come from? Oh, God painted it.
Oh, God made it.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, and then they.
Bring up your image. I'll show it again.
Sorry, I didn't clear it out too fast. I have to hit like 5 different buttons to get it on here. All right, can you see that?
Sorry, I know you got. So there's Hillary.
Yeah.
Genius, Hillary Clinton. My gosh.
Yeah, I just think that's really funny. Just like a weird way that intersects.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin. Over to you.
Cool. Okay, we're gonna jump in time a lot again. So we're gonna go all the way up to 1851 for Our Lady of La Salette. I still don't think that there's going to be a whole lot of disagreement on this panel yet. We're going to get to the disagreement pretty soon, though, but I still think that we're going to agree about Our Lady of La Salette. Here's the story. On Saturday afternoon, September 19th, 1846, two children, Maximin and Melanie, ages 11 and 14, were tending sheep for their employers near La Salette in the French Alps. While they were tending their sheep, they saw a brilliant light brighter than the sun. As they approached, they noticed a beautiful lady seated on a rock and crying with her face in her hands. In tears, she stood and spoke to them in their local French dialect. She spoke about the need of penance and how if France did not repent of her sin, then there would be grave consequences. That's kind of it. That's kind of the whole story. No miracles, no crowds. This one is kind of humble in scope. But this story took off and became like a sensation. People loved it. We actually have the letters that Maximin and Melanie wrote in 1851. So, yeah, 1848 is when they said that it happened. And in 1851, they wrote the letters and it really took off. And we still have these, which is awesome. I know it's really hard to read, and also it's in French, and also it's in rural French, like a dialect of rural French from 1851. So don't worry about trying to read it. I actually have the translations on this page. Here is Maximin's letter. You'll see that he starts it off by saying, on September 19th, 1846, we saw a beautiful lady. We never said that this lady was the Blessed Virgin, but we always said that it was a beautiful lady. I do not know if it was the Blessed Virgin or another person. As for me, I believe today that it was the Blessed Virgin. Here is what the lady said to me: if my people continue. So what she's saying is, if France doesn't repent, bad stuff is going to happen. And I tell you here, will arrive in the other century at the latest in the year 2000. What's going to arrive in the other century or by the latest the year 2000? Well, the Holy Father, the Pope, will be persecuted. His successor will be somebody that nobody expects. A great country, currently Protestant in the north of Europe, will be converted. And by the support of this country, all the other nations of the world will be converted. So crazy. Like a very Protestant country is going to become converted and then convert the rest of the world to Catholicism. And this is going to happen in the other century. What does that mean? The 1900s. It's the 1800s, so it's going to happen in the other century, the 1900s. If not then definitely by the year 2000. What year is it again? Hold on.
1848, right?
No, I mean, what year is it now?
Sorry, 2024. It's a shame they can never give like an exact year or like the name of the country. It's always a country in some time in the near future, but it's always very vague in the description.
Well, Our Lady did say at the latest in the year 2000.
So it'll be like it could happen by 1930, but we'll just give it 2000 just in case. You know, like why
Right.
you can't just give the exact one? It seems a little weird, but okay.
But it's after the year 2000, and the whole world's not Catholic. Also, bad things haven't really happened to. I mean, I guess bad things have happened to France. You know, it's French. That's pretty bad.
Kevin, she was going by the Islamic calendar, and that's we're actually not at the year 2000 yet. There, so
true.
She could be going by North Korea's calendar, where it's only like a year like 150 or whatever. So
is that true? I actually didn't know that.
Well, because North Korea starts the calendar by the day that the birthday of their first leader of Kim Il Sung, which I think was in the early 20th century. So that's
really funny.
It is, yeah.
Did not know that. We have Melanie's letter as well. Here it is. The part that I want to highlight is that she talks about like a lot of crazy things going on. A great king will go upon the throne. That's the throne of France, and will reign a few years. Religion will reflourish and spread all over the world, and there will be a great abundance. The world, glad to be lacking nothing, will again fall into its disorder, will give up God, and will become prone to criminal passions. Among God's ministers and the spouses of Jesus Christ, there will be some who go astray, and that will be the most terrible. Lastly, hell will reign on earth. It will be then that the Antichrist will be born of a sister, but woe to her. Many will believe in him because he will claim to have come from heaven. Woe to those that believe him. That time is not far away. Twice 50 years will not go by. So,
just so you know, Scott is just kind of saying the apocalyptic predictions may have just been embellishments by the seers and not part of the original experience or something.
We don't know. I mean, all that we have is what the seers told us, right? Yeah. Nobody else was there. Nobody else witnessed it.
But even just as a matter of theology, I mean, I know Dale and I have talked about this before, but if the whole point of this is to reveal a message that is supposed to be passed on to people, the idea that God would go out of his way to have the Virgin Mary materialize and go through all this really incredible effort to these people, but fumble the ball on getting it communicated properly where, oh gosh, I didn't mean, when I said this, they interpreted it the wrong way. She could have appeared and say, no, guys, I meant this, correct it. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. But the fact that it just, happened to get messed up in the translation and just didn't bother to fix it seems really strange, as if we would look at inerrancy or scripture inspiration the same way. It's a very lax way of looking at divine revelation, I would think.
For sure. We are starting to see the beginning of a new motif. So in the Middle Ages, we had this motif of Our Lady appearing and giving something tangible to somebody. We're starting this new motif now of Our Lady appearing and giving people secrets. We're going to see this over and over and over again now. Secrets. Our Lady is appearing and giving the seers something secret that they're going to communicate to the world, but only in their due time or whatever. Okay. On September 19th, 1851, the bishop of that region in France determined that the apparition, quote, bore in itself all the marks of truth, and that the faithful are justified in believing it to be certain and indubitable. It really seems like the bishop jumped the gun on this one, because here we are. It is both twice 50 years later, or more than twice 50 years later, and we are after the end of the other century, and it is after the year 2000. So by all accounts, all of these things should have happened by now. No Antichrist, no conversion of this, very Protestant country in Northern Europe to Catholicism, which then spread Catholicism throughout the whole world. That it hasn't happened. So Our Lady's predictions have failed. Despite the blatant failing of these prophecies, Our Lady of La Salette is still fairly popular. I think I said that whenever I Google it, I get a chapel in Louisville, Kentucky, instead of
That's where I'm from. That's where I'm from originally too.
No way. Are you? So I'm in Lexington.
Yeah, I think we did talk about this before when I was on your channel last time. That I'm originally from Louisville. Yeah, Lexington's a nicer city though, I think. But
I like Lexington. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, also, one of the stained glass windows in Our Lady of Fatima Chapel, the chapel that I grew up in, was Our Lady of La Salette. When we prayed the Rosary, we would say, like, at the end of the Rosary, we'd ask a whole bunch of different saints to pray for us. And we would say, like, Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us. Our Lady of Lourdes, pray for us. Our Lady of Knock, pray for us. Our Lady of La Salette, pray for us. Like, Our Lady of La Salette was, like, part of our list of, part of our pantheon. I say that lovingly. But what's weird is that Maximin and Melanie were never canonized, which is very rare. When people, so think about the first three that we went over. Our Lady of the Rosary appeared to Saint Dominic. Our Lady of Mount Carmel appeared to Saint Simon Stock. Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to Saint Juan Diego. But Our Lady of La Salette appeared to Maximin and Melanie. They are not Saint Maximin and Melanie. And why not? Well, they kind of went off the deep end later in life. So they were 11 and 14 when the apparitions took place. Maximin was like in and out of rehabs in France, like, 19th century rehabs and stuff. He had like a real alcohol problem. Melanie was considered to be like off her rocker a little bit, I think. And like they both died like penniless and like friendless, I think. So my confirmation name is Saint John Vianney. And Saint John Vianney lived in the same general time and in France, in France in the 1800s. And Maximin actually went to John Vianney one time for like spiritual guidance or whatever. And then like the next day, John Vianney was telling everybody, like, Maximin told me that he made up the whole thing. And then Maximin was like, I did not say that. John Vianney, Father John, he's old and he's hard of hearing, and it's not his fault that he misheard me. I wasn't speaking clearly enough, but I definitely did not say that. And then St. John Vianney was kind of like, okay, maybe I did hear him wrong. I don't know. But he seemed pretty like, I don't know, man. Like he told me he made the whole thing up. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why Maximin and Melanie were never canonized. And I think that their non-canonization is like a tacit admission by the Catholic Church that they're like, guys, I'm not really buying this one. And Jimmy Akin, a popular Catholic apologist, has a whole episode on La Salette. And he's like very critical of La Salette. And he ends it with like, guys, I don't think this one's real. But for whatever reason, a ton of churches are named after Our Lady of La Salette. She appears in stained glass windows in a ton of churches. Like she's prayed. Like, I don't know how she's still so popular. And Caleb, I bet that you don't disagree with me a whole lot on this one either.
I would imagine that, I think taking testimony from children in general is problematic, but for these kinds of things, but especially ones who grew up to have either mental issues or became substance dependent, and may or may not have confessed to faking it, that I think is all the red flags you would probably not want in a case like this, right?
Yeah. And Scott is adding that Melanie and Maximin lived rather disordered lives. Melanie was in and out of convents. So yeah, thanks, Scott. So I think that this one might be like the clearest of all. Frankly, it might be even clearer than the earlier ones that this one is not real. Okay, we're gonna jump forward just a few years in history to Our Lady of Lourdes in 1858. This is where Caleb and I might start to have some level of disagreement, but I'm not even going to focus as much on the healings. I will a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about the apparition itself.
By the way, before we go on, I know we're both from Kentucky, but I think it's technically, I think the S is silent, so it's Lourdes, or if you really want to be technical, Lourdes. But Lourdes, yeah. So I think the S is dropped, though, in the pronunciation.
I think you're right, but my whole chapel growing up, and so by the way, I actually grew up in New Jersey, but we all said Lourdes, Our Lady of Lourdes, pray for us. But I think it's just because we were Americans in the 90s, and like
right. Yeah.
But it is Lord. Or Lord. Yeah. We had a French priest at our chapel growing up, Father Guichard, and he always made a big deal of like making fun of all of our awful French pronunciations, but we didn't stop.
That's cool. Yeah.
But so the story of Our Lady of Lourdes, I'm going to say it even harder now, In February of 1858, the 14-year-old poor French peasant Bernadette Subaru, like the car, claimed that Our Lady had been appearing to her. Crowds gathered at each subsequent appearance, and at the appearance on the 25th of February, 1858, Bernadette said that Our Lady told her to go bathe in the water at the grotto. And so the grotto, by the way, it's like a close to a river, but not in the river itself. Kind of like a little cave. Like this art here is actually kind of representative. But the only problem is there was no water at the grotto. So Bernadette's like, the river behind me. And if you watch the film, The Song of Bernadette from the 1940s, Bernadette actually like runs towards the river, and Our Lady goes, no, not that water, this water here in the grotto. And like there's just like mud. So Bernadette kind of like starts rubbing the mud all over herself and stuff, and Our Lady's like, yeah, I'm very pleased, good job. Well, the apparition ends, everyone goes home or whatever. Bernadette comes back to the grotto the next day, and somehow a spring, like a little river that connected to the real river, had formed, connecting like the grotto to the river, like not mud anymore, like real water, like a little stream, and that's wild. And so all of the townspeople started like bathing in this water, and they noticed that this water was healing them. There were 3 miracle cures in that same year, I believe. And ever since then, people have been making pilgrimages to this grotto in Lourdes. Bathing in, today, you don't bathe in it. You just kind of like touch it, I guess, as you like walk through a touristy area. But there are like walls full of canes and crutches and stuff where people like leave their crutches after they've been cured and all that. That's kind of like the story that you hear growing up. And that's the story that you get if you watch the 1940s film, A Song of Bernadette. The film does a really good job at cleaning up the actual history. This appears to be a case where the original description by the 14-year-old Bernadette was fairly pagan, but over time, it took on more traditional Marian imagery. So for instance, Bernadette referred to Our Lady as Acero. Acero as uo petito damisello. I'm definitely not pronouncing that in the right French accent, but a more literal interpretation or translation of that phrase would be like that girl there, like that little girl there. But you know how we say it girl in English, and like it girl doesn't mean like it and girl. It means the girl who's like cool. Well, like that girl there doesn't mean like that girl there. It means forest fairy or pixie. There is so the Pyrenees Mountains are rich with like folklore and like old wives' tales. And there were these tales of these aceros, these like little pixies that like live in the forest, and they live in grottos and stuff like that. And if you misbehave, they will, give you an upset stomach. These like little fairies, like that's just like part of the folklore. And the fact that Bernadette was referring to Our Lady as Acero, and by the way, Bernadette referred to Our Lady as Acero for the rest of her life, and it freaked everybody out. That would be like, so I guess there's no perfect English like example for me to use, but imagine that Our Lady appeared to me and I was calling her like homegirl. Like that would like all like Catholics would be like, you cannot refer to Our Lady as homegirl. You can't do that. But Acero is kind of like homegirl, but it also means forest fairy. And then they built a statue of Our Lady of Lourdes. And Bernadette was like, oh, that statue is an adult woman. That is not what Acero looks like. Acero is like this tall. And everyone's like, oh God, oh no, this is not good. Also, she described Acero as having like shoes made of flowers and stuff like that. And that's what the forest fairies had, is they had like shoes made of flowers and stuff like that. And by the way, I'm getting all this stuff from a book that I have linked. The whole book is available on the internet. It's called Lourdes, Body and Spirit in a Secular Age. Here's a quote
Is
from
that by Ruth Cranston, I think.
It's Ruth something or other. Ruth Harris.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's a different Ruth who also writes about Lourdes, which makes it confusing to get them mixed up. But yeah.
Oh, okay. So you know what's funny is I know that you're familiar with like the 2014 article.
Yeah.
That article,
the medical cures, Lourdes cures revisited.
Yes.
Yeah.
That article quotes this book, quotes Lourdes' body and spirit in a secular age.
I think that's one of the most well-known books from the, at least in English, from the mid 20th century. I would say, like, usually that's the one that's the most cited that I've seen. But there's a couple others from some of the Lourdes medical doctors at the time from like the early 20th century that are done as well. But
so sorry, just because it's showing. I'm just looking at the slide, and it's saying that the Ruth Harris book dates to 1999.
Yeah,
is that like a more modern? Okay, because Caleb's saying it dates from the mid 20s.
I'm getting this mixed. I think I'm getting mixed up with Ruth Cranston's book from the 1950s, which I think, and Ruth Cranston was a Protestant, but Ruth Harris. This is why I said I was confusing the two, because they're both named Ruth, and it was throwing me off. I think one of them has a book from the 50s, and Harris's book is from 99.
The 2014 Scientific Journal article quotes from Ruth Harris's 1999 book, Lourdes' Body and Spirit in a Secular Age. That's actually how I found this book. I found a copy of it online for free. It's on the Internet Archive. So anyway, here's just like a little snippet from the book. Like their Celtic counterparts, Pyrenees fairies appeared sometimes as serpents or cats, but more often as enchanting little women, only a little bigger than dwarves. Dressed in luminous white, they were beautiful, capricious creatures linked to cosmic forces. Flower grew where they walked. They stir up and calm storms as they will. And so, by the way, that capricious comment there, Our Lady was asking Bernadette to do weird stuff. Like, hey, Bernadette, roll in the mud for me. Hey, Bernadette, go eat those bitter plants over there. Like, weird stuff. That stuff is actually depicted in the 1940 whatever film, The Song of Bernadette. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Acaro made Bernadette drink the mud water and eat the bitter herbs that grew in the grotto as a form of penance. Some townspeople thought that poor Bernadette was crazy. Bernadette's body showed possessive and convulsive and hysterical signs, I guess. Newspaper described how she appeared tired and burst into short, broken, nervous laughter. Another described how her hands began to tremble and the nervous twitching sets in, while still a third describes how her lip shook convulsively before the onset of ecstatic immobility. These kinds of symptoms were once again attested to by 3 physicians called in to examine her to see if she required confinement. So local newspapers at the time were saying, like, this poor girl seems like she's having some kind of episode. I think that's kind of weird that we have this 14-year-old girl who says that a forest fairy appeared to her and told her to go eat bitter herbs and roll around in the mud. But she also told her to do penances. And then everyone's like, oh, it's got to be Our Lady. And then Bernadette's like, yeah, I guess it was Our Lady. But none of that says anything about the healings, right? So let's also talk about that. While I am sure that some of the healings are legitimately baffling to medical experts, not all are. And then I linked to that 2014 article that we were talking about. The article examines the cures recorded in Lourdes between 1858 and 1976, which it says is the last state certified cure of the 20th century, even though there was a Vatican-approved miracle in like 1990 something.
It was of Jean-Pierre Bailly. Yeah, so that's... Yeah. So, I don't know why they said that. I was confused, unless they're talking about a particular... we mentioned this in our show, too, because like that's just not correct, because Jean-Pierre Bailly... And plus, there were other ones that were certified. Maybe they just were looking at the sample, but there were 3 other ones that were certified by 2013, and this article was published in 2014, so they didn't mention some of the other ones as well, from 2005, 2012, and 2013. So I don't know why, but
I don't know. Otherwise, a good article though. And it says that initially the records of cures were crude or non-existent, and allegations of cures were accepted without question. So when you hear about the thousands of medical cures, I think that you should be skeptical of that. James Randi, a famous magician, really, but he was also like a skeptic and like a investigative journalist kind of guy. He did investigations where he hired doctors to look into one of the modern Lourdes healings, the case of Serge Perrin. When Ellen Bernstein, the editor of the Medical and Health Annual of the Encyclopedia Britannica, at the time that James Randi published it, when she looked at the data that James Randi was able to get from the Lourdes Medical Bureau, Ellen said, if Sir J. Perrin's case is representative, there are good reasons to be distrustful of the officially declared miracle cures at Lourdes. There are also reasons to question the allegedly rigorous system for recognizing them. The expertise and skills of the doctors are at best a matter of chance, since being present at the shrine and being a certified physician are the only requirements for joining the medical bureau. So I think that there are reasons to be skeptical of the medical cures. Now, again, I'm not saying that definitely all of them are bogus. There's no way for, I think, one person to sift through. There are a couple thousand cases that the Lourdes Medical Bureau recognizes. The Vatican recognizes 70 of those. But even going through those 70 sounds like it, like, and you'd have to like call the Lourdes Medical Bureau and ask for like records and stuff like that. And even if they gave me the records, I wouldn't know what to do with them, you know? Like I don't know what I'm looking at. But I do think that there is reason to be skeptical of the number of cures that Lourdes has claimed. It seems like Lourdes is another case of like later editions forcing the story to line up with more orthodox Mariology. While I am sure that some of the healing that has taken place there over the last 160 years since the first healing are legitimately cases of like rare spontaneous remission, I think that the vast majority of them, there is nothing out of the ordinary. And then I link my own video to it. But I'm particularly interested to get Caleb's thoughts on this section.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So I think let's talk about the apparition first before we get to the healings, because those are sort of two different things. I think
just in your answer that you're about to give, I'm particularly interested in the fact that the apparition was originally a pagan, having nothing to do with Mary or something like that. And it was almost like the Roman Catholics adopted that. So I'm just wondering, does that impact your study at all? So yeah, just incorporate that into whatever you're going to say.
So I will say I haven't read enough into the particular aspect about the little girl. So I haven't, most literature I've read doesn't mention that. So I'm not going to say whether or not that's true. I'll grant that for the sake of argument. As far as I understood the little part, though, I do know that when she saw Our Lady, she did say she looked very young, like was her age, like 14-year-old one. And it is true that she didn't immediately identify it as Mary. She called it the woman, right? Typically, or like the pretty woman or whatever it was. I think it was the second to last appearance, because there was like, I think 18 of them, if I'm not mistaken,
in like a month. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like roughly a month's time. The second to last one is when the woman said, "Je suis l'Immaculée Conception," or "I am the Immaculate Conception," and that's where people were like, "Ah, okay, so that's Mary." That's when you had started having the devotion in that way. But there were other aspects. So he mentioned that there were doctors that examined her. That's true. Although, as far as I recall, all the psychiatrists who examined her did not declare her like mad or hysterical. They did say that she was of sound mind, even though they thought there were some aspects. Now, granted, 19th century psychiatry was not an exact science, so I don't think that means all that much, you know, in a pre-Freudian field. But that's something, right? And there were, although it is true that no one saw Our Lady besides Bernadette, usually there would be a crowd that would gather as she was there watching. And I think she was threatened by police to like stop, because it was kind of causing, I don't want to say a disturbance, but people were getting a lot of attention to this and it was having an unwelcome crowd. So she was threatened a few times by police that she'd be thrown in jail or like beaten with a stick or something if she didn't stop and she kept doing it. So you could say maybe she was at least sincere in her convictions or was willing to undergo some persecution. But there were a few, you could call them quasi miracles or signs that people saw while she was doing this, even though they didn't see Mary herself. One of these was allegedly she was transfigured like Christ, where witnesses from the time saw her glow. Some people say maybe the sun was just shining on her from a certain way. Some people say it was a heavenly glow. And there was another time where she was praying with to Mary and she would usually go in these trance-like states for long periods of time, you know, where she was just like looking straight ahead and didn't really break her gaze when she was allegedly talking to Our Lady. And at one point, and we have a letter from a doctor who was an eyewitness to this, she was holding a candle and he noticed that the way that her hand was on it, her hand like was basically on the fire and she didn't react at all. And after she got out of this trance, he like went and like grabbed the candle and like slightly burned her, and she jumped back after that and like had pain. But while she was in that trance-like state, she acted like she didn't feel anything. Now, there are ways magicians can do that, or you can put stuff on it to mitigate that. So that's a possibility, although that seems like that would indicate some kind of intentional fraud at that point. But I don't know. I don't know if it's like co-walking, though, where you can just get yourself in a mind where you could ignore that. There's just a lot of things that you can't really tell. But I think those elements make it interesting. Another thing is that when they had exhumed the body 30 years after her death, it was for the most part incorrupt, right? And this is not a standard that the Catholic Church uses anymore, because there are ways that a body can naturally mummify if it's a dry enough environment. But when they buried her, she was buried with a cross, and the cross was oxidized when they undid the body, when they exhumed it. But the skin was intact, her organs were still intact, very little deterioration. Now, what is interesting is that when they dug her up, they changed her clothes and washed the body and stuff like that before they reburied her. And when they did that is when it started to have like a mark on its face. So when they exhumed it the second time, it was in worse condition, and then a third time. So it's interesting that 30 years later, it's in pretty good condition for the most part. And then it's only when humans like intervene is when it kind of gets messed up and stuff. So if you go to, let me see if I can find the picture here. So if you go to Lourdes today, they have the body on display, but the one that you'll see is wax coated. So it has a face mask. So it's not the original one that
when you share it, I'll bring it up.
Yeah. I'm trying to find this on here real fast. I think this is it. Yeah. So let me bring up. So this is the earliest picture. I don't think we have a photo from the original exhumation that I know of. This is from the last one from 1925. Oh, is that going to zoom in? Hold on. This is the wax covered one that you'll see if you go to the actual church. And this photo, I don't know if I can zoom in on that. If you can see that, you can see her laid out there is the body taken in 1925. So she died in, I think, the 1870s, if I'm not mistaken. First exhumation was 1909. Second was 1919. The last one, I think, was 1925. So this was the last one. So that's typically how it is. And this is after the body's been washed and treated and they've taken some of the stuff off of it, right? But it still looks like it's in pretty good shape. But it's not as in good shape as it was at the time. But we do have doctor statements from the time when it was first exhumed saying the liver was intact and all this stuff who examined it in that way. I think there's a clearer picture as well. But you get the general idea behind that.
Okay, so just before I bring it back to Kevin, so I'm just interested again, because one of the most important things to me is if these miracles, if there is validity to the miracle healings, which I know is what you're focused on, obviously they do derive from this vision. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, Kevin's correct that the origin of this story did have, if not pagan, it was about kind of a forest fairy or something like that. What sort of implications would that have for your study about the miracle healings? Like I would find that problematic kind of thing.
Well, I mean, and
Why?
if it was from a Marian standpoint, as someone who's not a Catholic, I could find that problematic as well, right, with my own theology. But in general, I think that the fact that someone might initially think something is pagan and then be convinced through further evidence that, oh, no, this actually is something from God, is not unusual. In fact, in the Bible, when they first see Jesus, they think he's a ghost, right? A spirit, something that wouldn't be super consistent with that. And then only when they interact with him more do they discover, oh, no, actually, this is Christ, right? So I think you could just have sort of progressive revelation in that regard if you wanted to defend it to that degree. But I think there's a legit question in terms of where these healings relate, in terms of are these meant to vindicate Bernadette's vision, or are they meant to not, right? So I don't think that the vision itself is all that well documented. Well, it's well documented, but like well compelling in terms of being able to be explained. But I think when you combine the weird things like the body being incorrupt and the fire and the transfiguration and the healings, you could potentially give natural explanations for most of this. But the combination of those, like with this one person who's very unique individual, right? What are the chances that this would all happen to this one 14-year-old girl if this was all illegitimate? I think does raise some kind of probability. And I do think that a lot of the healings are genuinely compelling. And as Kevin said, it really just depends on the nature of it. I think that some of the earlier ones, particularly of tuberculosis, are really interesting because tuberculosis is a very physical, at least it can be. Usually it starts in the lungs, but it can get, especially back then, it can spread to parts of the body. So I think one of the most actually, you know what? I have photos of one if you want to see. This one is not actually a tuberculosis one. But this was of a woman named, I'll bring up pictures in a second, but named Marie Borel. And this was in the early 20th century, like I think 1904-ish, around that. And she had had multiple surgeries. She'd had an appendectomy. And so they did the surgeries. And of course, surgeries back then were not perfect. So they basically had botched it. Within a few months, the wound opened back up and created a fistula, you know, this big orifice. And they had to stitch it back up, and then it opened a second time. And not only that, but then more opened up. So she basically ended up having 4 in her back and 2 in her side, in her, no, I'm sorry, it was the other part. She had 4 in her front and 2 in her back. And one of them was like deep enough you could stick a thumb in it. But she basically had these really big sores that had pus and coming out exceedingly. And the ones in her abdomen pierced so deep as to pierce her small intestine. And there was, towards the end of it, fecal matter coming out as well. So really disgusting and gross. They had to have bandages every day. But the point is, this is not something that you're just going to easily misdiagnose. Like anyone with eyes can see if someone has a hole in their stomach or their back that has pus coming out of it and fecal matter, to where clearly they're not okay, right? So she was in a very critical condition, got progressively worse over several years, hospitalized, and none of this worked. No treatment did. So she goes to Lourdes on a stretcher. She weighs about 60 pounds at this point, completely emaciated, can barely walk at all, could barely eat. And the first day she goes in there, nothing happens. The second day she goes in there, all of the pus stops and starts to dry over. And by the third day, they're completely scarred over with new skin in that way, within, you know, a few hours of each other. And then she went to the medical bureau, or what the version of it was at the time. And let me find it here. You're getting to see a preview of my book, by the way, in terms of
Nice.
the program I'm using here.
So some guys are real.
There you go. So these are the photos taken right after. So yeah, I know. So you can see these are the 4 in her abdomen, and you can see where the intestine was, where the tissue is, and where it just closed with new skin. So they're freshly there, where you can clearly see the indentions and the scars, and these are the ones in her back. The back one's really deep in there. So these basically scarred over and closed with new skin the same day that she put herself in these in the grotto, right? And so she was healed of this. They checked in with her next year, and she was still healed. They then took up medical certificates from her doctors, from both the Lourdes doctors and her primary physician. And I think it was 3 or 4 years after the healing, when she was still there, they declared this a miracle, right? Because she hadn't relapsed. And she would go on, and she would eventually die, I think, of an unrelated heart condition, but she never had a relapse of this condition, which is pretty impressive, because take in mind, when she'd had this, she'd had treatment for years, and it had only made it worse. It had kept opening up. The pus had gotten worse. She became more emaciated, to where she lost the ability to walk, and clearly had this condition where she was bleeding profusely, had pus coming out profusely. And within a matter of just a few hours, new skin covers it up, new tissue, the regeneration back of new bodily tissue, which is pretty impressive. And again, pretty obvious to anyone with eyes, and not something you could easily say is a misdiagnosis, given that this happened over 100 years ago. So stuff like that, I think, is pretty surprising. And I haven't been able to find anything in the secular literature that's comparable to that, of all that, not just one of them closing, but all 6 of these closing within a few hours of each other, with the timing of this, despite only having gotten worse over time, right? So I feel like spontaneous remission by itself doesn't really explain that well in terms of the timing, unless you just want to say it's coincidence. And the fact that affected all 4 of them, and the fact that it didn't open up again and relapse like it hadn't before, and the fact that her health had only been getting worse, all of that combined, I think, makes it pretty compelling. So stuff like that, and again, that's one of many. So I think particular cases like that, where it's a very visible disfigurement, are particularly compelling.
All right. So Kevin, you've heard everything that Caleb has had to say, so I want to let you kind of engage with him. But I am curious about your take. I know the show's not on the miracle healings, but it is attached to the vision. So I'm kind of curious if there is any legitimacy to any of these healings.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say toward, given what we know about this, the problems with this appearance? If there is genuine miracle healings taking place, what implications would that have, do you think?
So, I mean, truthfully, if we are considering like non-natural explanations, it seems fair to me that we have to consider that Akero really did heal these people, and Akero is indeed like a forest fairy of Pyrenees folklore. I think that has to be considered if we are considering non-natural explanations. Now, Were you talking, Caleb? Oh, good. Okay.
I was just fixing my camera. Go ahead.
Oh, all good. All good. Yeah. Now, I think that might, I'm going to have some problems with just considering non-natural explanations in the first place, because like if it's completely not empirical in the slightest, then we simply can know nothing about it, right? Because if it's not empirical, it can't cause us to know anything because it's going to be completely acausal. So I'm of the mindset that like, kind of considering non-natural explanations is almost a waste of time, because of the acausal nature of anything that's like immaterial. But yeah, it seems to me like, if we're going to think that like, maybe this is like legitimately a Catholic miracle, maybe it's a pagan miracle too, right? Maybe it's a Caro healing people.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's it for my questions. In terms of the chat, so we just have a couple of things. So Bernadette, in her time in the convent, displayed sanctity, and her prime focus was Christ, despite the doubts of Sister Vazu, who was a classic snob.
That is true. Bernadette did become a nun after this and died a nun. I forgot to mention that. She dedicated her life to the church, and is now a saint.
Okay. And he also says, in terms of Bernadette, I tend toward William James's mantra in his Varieties of Religious Experience by the fruit. Okay. So, yeah. So this person was legitimate, a good person kind of thing, or a good Christian, I guess.
I think you could say at least whatever you think, you could say she probably was sincere. I think that if I was going to come up with a natural explanation, I'd say she was probably hysterical and was maybe hallucinating. But I don't know what Kevin is. I don't think she was outright lying and deceiving people intentionally. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I think she probably believed what she was seeing.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of kids, because we're going to talk about this in Fatima a little bit, but some kids, I think, the line between doing it on purpose and then doing it like, doing it for attention versus being sincere, like, I don't know. I think that some people really sincerely need attention, and then they kind of convince themselves that, they're special or something like that. We're going to talk a little bit about that with Fatima, but I wouldn't be surprised. So here's a like a truth. It wasn't until the townspeople were like, whoa, we think that this is Our Lady, that it became Our Lady, right? And I think that Bernadette may have realized that like there was pressure for it to be Our Lady, so then it turned into Our Lady. Now, does that make her like malicious? No. And I don't think that she was necessarily malicious, but maybe she just really needed attention, and like, so her brain convinced her that this stuff was true, because subconsciously she knew that this was how she's going to get attention. And I don't think that's her fault necessarily. That just seems to me like it's fairly likely, especially as like we see this evolution of a Caro into the Blessed Virgin Mary. You know what I mean?
By the way, last thing before we move on, before I forget, if you want the best, in my opinion, critical approach to this, since I want to be fair to both sides here, it would be the book 11 Miracles of Lourdes by Donald West, who is a doctor. I think he was a medical doctor and a parapsychologist. This was written back in 1957, so it's definitely dated. But he was writing about the 11 most recent cases of his time, so between 1930 and I think 1950, whatever it was, when he was doing this. And he goes into very extensive detail about the medical records and all that stuff. And he doesn't find any of them to be compelling, or he finds them to be lacking. Now, there are a couple cases I think I don't think his explanations are very plausible, and he sort of oh, I'm sorry. It's 11 Lourdes Miracles by Donald West. It's also a pretty obscure book. This was I found a copy on Amazon, but this is a first edition, very clearly used, and it's very hard it's not an Internet Archive. It's very hard to find any information about this book. It's the only other copy I saw that was available for like $80 or something. So it's not very easy to get, unfortunately. Jeez. Yeah, and I literally got this book because I had seen someone who cited, I think Garlashelli actually cited it. And I knew that one of the cases that he mentioned was one of the ones I talked about in the book. And so I wanted to just address in a footnote. So I spent $25 just to get this book, for the 2 pages he spends on it to address. It was a lot more effort than I should have done, frankly. But I can put my conscience at ease to say I addressed like this very obscure, specific objection that was brought up. Other thing I'll say that's a cool souvenir is I actually got I think it was on Amazon, a bottle of Lourdes water just as a souvenir. And I have it in my office at work. I don't have it here, but I do have the card that came with it, which is kind of cool. So it's a picture of the sanctuary, And then on the back, it's a little prayer talking about how Our Lady appeared to Bernadette and believing all that. So that's kind of neat.
Nice. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, Kevin, over to you. I think we've got
Yeah.
the last case here. So yeah.
We do. And I'll just add a quick personal story about, well, maybe not personal, but so I had an uncle who passed away before I was born. My dad's brother passed away of cancer. And when he was dying, they went to Lourdes. No miracle cure for my uncle. But I do think that Lourdes brought my family peace in a time of, extreme hardship for them. Because my uncle, when he died, he was like 20 or something. Like, he was a kid. He was younger than I am now, which is like insane. So I think that, millions and I know that millions and millions and millions of people go to Lourdes every single year now. And it's funny, the rate of spontaneous remission at Lourdes is actually lower than that of the general population. Now, that is because the people who go to Lourdes are not the general population. They are the very sick population. But yeah, I think that while I'm happy that there are some like legit cases of spontaneous remission, I think that looking at Lourdes as if it's something out of the ordinary, I think is like a little bit misleading, especially when you look at the millions of people who go there, like my uncle, who, got into the water and nothing happened. So I think that's worth, keeping in mind.
Gotcha. All right, cool.
All right. Last one, Fatima. So here we are at the far right-hand side of our timeline. The year is 1917. 3 children claimed that Our Lady had been appearing to them on the 13th day of every month, and that on October 13th, October 13th, 1917 typo, she would give them a sign. Sure enough, on that day, the sun danced. Additionally, Our Lady made predictions. She said that 2 of the 3 children would die very soon, but Lucia would live a long time. So the 3 children are Lucia and her 2 cousins, Francisco and Jacinta, 2 girls and a boy. Our Lady prophesied in 1917 that Jacinta and Francisco would die very soon, but Lucia would live a long time. Okay. Also in 1917, she prophesied that World War I would end soon, and that an even worse war would break out during the pontificate of Pope Pius XI. Sure enough, so the sun did dance, and sure enough, the 2 other seers, they did die within just a few years. World War I did end soon, in fact, just 1 year after the apparition, and World War II began in 1939, and at the beginning of 1939, Pope Pius XI was indeed the Pope. So, miracle of the sun, deaths of the seers, World War I ending, World War II beginning. I mean, Our Lady of Fatima is 4 for 4, right? Like, that's super impressive. Regarding the prophecies, and so this is just the traditional story that I relayed. And this part is never mentioned. All of the prophecies were made after the fact. Lucia revealed the prophecy about the deaths of her cousins, which the deaths of her cousins occurred first. So the 2 different cousins, one died in 1919, the other died in 1920. The actual event was 1917. Lucia didn't tell everybody about this prophecy until 1927. So in 1927, Lucia, and by the way, so like everybody knew about the apparition, but then in 1927, Lucia was like, oh, by the way, one thing that I never told you guys that Our Lady told me was 10 years ago, Our Lady told me that my cousins were going to die soon, and they did. And the fact that that prophecy was revealed in 1927 is not part of the Fatima mythos. Like, if you go to a Catholic website, you will not find this. Lucia revealed the prophecy about the end of World War I and the start of World War II, which occurred. So World War I ended in 1918 and World War II began in 1939. She revealed that prophecy in 1941, 2 years into World War II. What's worse, too, and I will forgive this one, but Pope Pius XI died in February of 1939. Pope Pius XII was elected in March of 1939, and then World War II started in September of 1939. So that was when Pope Pius XII was reigning, not Pope Pius XI. Is that an error? by Lucia or by Our Lady of Fatima. Maybe. But also, wars aren't real. What do I mean by that? I mean that wars are nothing but collections of conflicts that we label for convenience, right? It's not like there was no conflict in Europe in between the end of World War I and the start of World War II. I mean, let's not forget the Spanish Civil War, where fascists were fighting against communists in Spain in the 1930s, like up until 1939. Like it was like the predecessor to World War II. So in 1941, I don't think that it was clear that future historians were going to say that World War II didn't begin until September 1939. So Lucia might have been thinking like, well, if we start the start of World War II as the start of the Spanish Civil War, then Pope Pius XI was the Pope. So I don't know. But yeah, wars aren't real. They're just man-made labels that we apply to a series of conflicts. So the start date of a war is arbitrary. So when Our Lady prophesied that Pope Pius XI would be the Pope during the start of the next great conflict after World War I, if you want to count it as sometime before the start, like before the Blitzkrieg of September 1939, fine. Then Our Lady was correct. Regardless, this prophecy wasn't revealed until 1941, well after both September 1939 or the start of the Spanish Civil War, whenever that was in the mid-30s or whatever. So all of these prophecies are after the fact. Regarding the miracle of this, go ahead, Dale. Yeah.
Very quick follow-up here. So obviously it seems very suspect that, okay, they're revealing these prophecies because they received all these prophecies at once, according to the story, right? And
well, they received them all in 1917 between the months of April and October. When was the first apparition? I forget. But yeah, it would have all been 1917 when they received these.
So it's just very suspect. Like, did anyone challenge her and say, like, well, why are you just revealing this stuff about World War II now in 1941? Like, why didn't you reveal this in 1927 and reveal everything at once? Like, was there ever any response to that kind of objection? Because that's just the obvious thing that comes up.
Not that I know of. Now, I can say that the World War I prophecy does actually, so we do have, so as soon as the miracle of the sun happened and all that, the Catholic Church actually sent a priest, Father Formigao, to Fatima to like interview the children. And Father Formigao said to Lucia, so Our Lady told you that World War I was going to end soon? And Lucia said to Father Formigao, no, Our Lady said that the war ends today. And Father Formigao means like, he was like, you mean like the day that the sun danced? And Lucia's like, yep, Our Lady said that the war ends this very day and that our soldiers will be coming home soon. And Father Formigao says to Lucia, I read the newspaper on the train right over here. Like, there is still fighting going on. And Lucia's like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, I'm just telling you what the lady told me. Kind of weird. Of course, that was in 1917 that Father Formigao interviewed the then like 14-year-old Lucia or whatever. And then in 1941, when Lucia is in her 40s, she changes her tune and says that Our Lady didn't say that it was ending this day, it was ending soon. And sure enough, it ended a year later. And then she adds the World War II part.
Yeah.
But even soon, if it was 1917, that would have been already towards the closing of like the tail end of it anyway, right? So, and of course, every war will eventually end. I mean, at least all of the ones that happened so far. So, to say, even if she had gotten it like within a few days or something, you could have said, well, this is towards the end of the war was already wrapping up at this point anyway, or something, right? It's like how Joseph Smith predicted the Civil War. But there were lots of people who were predicting a civil war because the tensions were so high. So it wasn't like that impressive that people were saying, oh, maybe the states are going to secede because of all this stuff. So I think it's the same principle.
And apparently Scott is saying that Lucia herself claimed that her superiors asked her to write all this down later on. She did so under great duress or something, apparently. So
yeah. If I click on this link, no, you guys won't see it. Give me one moment and I will like change the way that I'm sharing my screen or whatever. Here, let me do. Oh, I have to hit this. Sorry, give me 1 second. All I'm doing is I'm following the link on that page that I had. Oh, and you know what? It's not even going to actually be that one, but that's okay. Here we go.
If you share the
So,
entire screen, it'll. Okay, so it's popping up.
yeah. So it's not this slide. It is. Let's see. Oops. No. Can I go backwards? Yes, I can. Here it is. See this link on the bottom of the screen here? I'm going to click on that, and it's going to bring up this book. It's called Fatima in Lucia's Own Words. Yep, Fatima in Lucia's Own Words. Here it is. And then, so most of this book is just Lucia's memoirs. So I'm going to go to like roughly page like 180. And then I'm going to scroll up until I get to the beginning of this memoir. This should be the fourth memoir. And it starts with a note from the author of from the compiler of this text, not from Lucia herself. And it talks about the duress that she was under when she was writing this. Lucia did not want to talk about this. Here we go. Let's see. And I can zoom in a little bit too. There we go. So this introduction is not Lucia's own words. Lucia's own words start here. JMJ, Jesus, Mary, Joseph. And then it's addressed to Your Excellency because a bishop asked her to write this down and she did not want to. So let's see. The longest of all the memoirs came into existence like the previous ones by chance, as it were, being written not on Lucia's own initiative, but at the request of her superiors. On October 7th, 1941, the Bishop of Lyra and Reverend Dr. Galamba, well prepared for further interrogations, came to Valencia do Minho, and there Lucia joined them. They brought the third memoir with them, explained what Dr. Galamba now desired to know, and presented Dom Jose's formal request. They so stressed the need for haste that Lucia sent the first notebook to the bishop immediately upon its completion on November 5th. The second and last notebook was finished by the 8th of December. Now, what was requested of Lucia? Someone wanted her to write down everything without delay. Lucia was asked to do a lot. Lucia spared no effort in dealing with these. Let's see. Yeah, she did not want to write any of these. So the bulk of this is her four memoirs, and she didn't want to write any of them. She did not, but the bishops forced her to, pretty much. And that's where most of the Fatima mythos is very, very different, depending on what time frame you're looking at. The Fatima mythos prior to the 1940s was kind of just, hey, a whole bunch of people got together and they saw something funky in the sky, and that's kind of it. But then all this Marian stuff started getting built up and built up and built up as Lucia released these memoirs, and it still continues to get built up today because, and I didn't make a slide about this, but there was the third and final secret that Lucia asked for the Pope not to reveal to anybody, but she wrote it directly to the Pope. So the Pope read it. Eventually in the year, I believe it was the year 2000, the Pope made public the third secret. But there's a decent amount of Catholics, the kinds of Catholics that I used to be, the traditionalists, who think that the Vatican was lying about the third secret, and that the third secret is actually about how the Pope is going to apostatize and stuff, but they don't want to admit that the Pope is going to apostatize. So that's why they are not revealing the true third secret and stuff. It's crazy. Fatima is almost a religion unto itself.
Yeah. Interesting. I think we agree that the prophecy aspect is pretty weak. I think the only real interesting thing here is the miracle of the sun.
Cool. Yeah. And here's where we might agree a lot here. I wrote, it's legitimately impressive. We have dozens of reports made contemporaneously, including a newspaper that said that tons of people saw it. And what did they see? Something in the sky. They described it as the sun dancing. Some used the word rolling. The sun was rolling in the sky. And what's interesting too is that Father Formigao asked the children, what did you see? And Francisco called it I saw a rolling ball of fire in the sky that was zigzagging around. Lucia said something like, I saw a white disc that didn't hurt to look at it. Like I could look at this white disc, and this disc seemed to like rotate upon itself and then come in closer towards us. So you can see that like it's all similar. Like people saw different things. Some people said that they saw all different colors of the sun being radiated from the sun. Like they saw like a rainbow coming out of the sun, kind of. Some people said that the sun came closer to the earth. Some people said like different things, but it's all in the same vein.
And some people said they didn't see anything either, too. Right?
Yes, some people said that they didn't see anything.
Right.
And that's what I wrote here. We have a letter from a certain Marchioness Isabel, and she wrote to her priest saying, "Father, why didn't I see anything? Like, am I not worthy? Like, what?" She was distraught over this. And I think that's interesting. We have a letter from Leonor de Avalar e Silva Constancio. So both of them, I guess. I'm sure that one of them wrote it. I'm not sure, but they wrote that they got stuck in the mud about a mile outside of the Cova de Iria where it happened. And so by the time that their car got unstuck, they had missed it. They were about 10 minutes too late. They got there and everyone was talking about it. And they were like, I can't believe I missed it, which I kind of find to be hilarious. Because if the sun legitimately did careen towards the earth, you think that being a mile away wouldn't change anything, but evidently it did. If you ask me, this has a lot more to do with the psychology of crowds, because you'll notice that people who weren't in the crowds didn't see it. Now, some people from like tens of miles away did say that they saw it years later, which I think is interesting. But the
right. So I was about to ask that because I've heard that as well. But if it's like after the Fatima story becomes popular, and they're like, oh, actually, yeah, no, I do remember seeing that thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like that would be like me telling you now that if I got onto the highway near my house, I could see the New York City skyline growing up. I grew up in northern New Jersey. So I was in northern New Jersey, 25 miles outside of Manhattan on like in November 2001. So like theoretically, I could tell you today that I saw like the smoke from 9/11 from my house. And that's believable. But it's not true. I was also 6 years old. So I was 6 or 7 or whatever.
But you can maybe convince yourself of that. You don't even have to be intentionally lying. Your brain can make you rethink that.
Bingo.
In fact, that's happened to me in other cases, in that way. Like, I don't know. I don't want to go off. I may give it another example later, but I've had something like that happen where it's kind of like a Mandela effect almost, where it's like I could have sworn that's what it was, and it actually isn't. And so it's interesting how human psychology works. Now, in terms of, sorry, if you had anything else you wanted to wrap up on that, you can before I give.
I was just going to add that false memories are surprisingly common. There have been studies done where scientists wanted to see if they could implant fake memories into people just by asking leading questions, and they did easily. Right. So it's like our brains are not the logic machines that we wish that they were.
Yeah, and so I think there's a bunch of points that could be made on this. I tend to lean against this and to be pretty skeptical of it, although I do think there's some elements there. I think the points against it, as you said, the testimonies are contradictory. To me, that's the weakest point against it, because even with events that actually do happen, you can have inconsistency. So the fact that there was inconsistency in secondary details is not itself proof that it didn't happen, because you can do that with a car accident or anything like that. It doesn't mean the car didn't actually crash, right? So I think it's a weaker objection. I think one of the strongest ones, and this is maybe just my particular conception of a miracle, but I think it's the same issue you have with something like Muhammad splitting the moon in half, where obviously the sun did not actually get closer to the earth, because that would be detectable not only everywhere on Earth, but like you could see the electromagnetism change. There'd be 100,000 things that would be different, right? If the sun was this much closer to us. So you're going to have to say, well, the miracle was the illusion, maybe a divinely caused illusion of seeing it, right? But if you're going to say that this was an illusion, then it seems like you're really stretching for straws to say that, like, okay, why I think that a divinely caused illusion and imagination is better than some kind of naturally hysterically induced one, right, under that one. I know there was an article I was reading, I think it was published back in the early 2000s, about a doctor who was, this was actually in Medjugorje and not Fatima, but he said that people who were pilgriming there, he told them to not stare at the sun because a lot of them were trying to do that and claiming to see the sun move in that way because it's damaging to the eyes. So I think that's another thing there in that aspect. Now the parts that I and of course there are people who said they didn't see it at all, which is kind of interesting, and that's actually not uncommon with these kinds of mass events, right? Where some people see it, some people don't. There's actually Philip Weeb has a good book on apparitions of Jesus, and he gives an account that happened in the 1950s in a church where Jesus allegedly appeared to a congregation, about 200 people. When he interviewed people a couple of years, several like decades later, some of them remembered it, some of them didn't, some of them remembered it differently. And it's like, how would you not remember Jesus appearing to your congregation, right? So it's kind of like one of those things. But the points to me that I'm curious your thoughts on these that make me reconsider, I think the weakest one is that I've heard in the reporting that allegedly this was right after a rainstorm, that so maybe the puddles and clothes instantly dried up as well. I don't know if that's confirmed. I've read some people saying that's sort of hearsay and that it wasn't originally reported. So we'll put that one aside. But I do wonder if this was some meteorological like event in the sky, like it was, like a rainbow or something after the sun. I do wonder how these girls could have accurately predicted something like that so far in advance before modern meteorology was really a thing, to be able to predict some abnormal weather event if that's what this was. So let me just finish it. That's one thing I would say. The second one would be that let's suppose it wasn't some weird weather event and it was just a purely mass hysterical kind of thing. I do wonder if it could apply to that many people, but also more importantly that Tyler McNabb has an article, he's a Catholic philosopher. He has an article on Fatima, and he argues that if this was something that was induced by staring at the sun for so long, that you would have expected permanent retina damage to the eyes. And that's what you often observe with these. But we don't have any reports that I know of people having significant blindness or something after the fact, despite staring at the sun where it didn't hurt, right? So that's another weird thing, too, is like if this was induced by some illusion by staring at the sun with expectation, it's surprising that you don't have a lot of people reporting going blind or having damage from this in that way. So I think there's still open questions that I don't have answers to, but there's enough there to make me skeptical.
Yeah. What I will say is that the children didn't actually predict that there would be a solar event on October 13th. They said that there would be a sign. So what that sign would be was not known until the sun dance.
But didn't they tell them to look up at the sky, like on the day, not beforehand, but did they tell them that day that it was going to be the sky, or did they just sit around and someone's like, oh, wait, the sun looks weird?
That one.
Is it? Okay, I don't know. I had heard versions of the story where they tell them to look, the Virgin tells them to look up at the sky, and they do, but maybe that's later. I don't know.
If you look at the movie, like if you watch the movie, Our Lady does kind of like, lift her hands up. And then somebody in the crowd is like, look at the sky. And then there's like this whole big thing.
And the people in the crowd don't see Mary. They see the sky. Only the children see Mary.
What's funny though is that the October apparition was not the only apparition at which crowds were gathered. There were people claiming to have seen Mary at the previous gatherings. You get this crowd of a couple hundred people or whatever for the August apparition. And most of the people in the crowd said that they didn't see Mary and that only the seers, the three children, saw Mary. But there were always a couple people in the crowd who were like, no, I saw Mary too. I saw Mary. And so I think that it's just important to I think it's important to realize that humans are really good at seeing what we want to see. And that sucks for us, right? That's awful.
And this is why I don't really like, and Dale, I think will disagree with me here. I'm not a big fan of sort of the minimalist approach to the resurrection, where people say, well, multiple people saw Jesus reportedly, and people can't have mass hallucinations, right? And it's like that's a very crude way of putting it, because you do have instances like this where if you think it's probable to think that this was some mass social contagion, hysterical event. There have been people who've applied this to the reference we get to he appeared to 500, which we don't know anything about. Some people say, could it be something like this where there was a crowd and someone said, "Oh, I see Jesus," and they did, and it was. And again, we have no idea what the details were, but could it be something like that? Who knows, right? But obviously, as a Christian, I don't think that's what it was. But I can say that I don't think evidentially it's very strong because I think of these kinds of parallels. And you have other ones too, right? Like you have my favorite example is Spring Hill Jack, if you've ever heard of that, from the 19th century.
No.
It's jumping over a wall.
Yeah, so there was a woman I think it was in the 1840s, 1820s, who reported that she was attacked by this man with claws who breathed fire at her and then leapt about 9 feet over a wall. Crazy, right? This was reported in the newspaper. Next day, another woman reports this attack, and then everyone starts seeing him and reports it. It got so bad that the mayor of London had to call a crisis of emergency to like shut the place down. And there was carriages where people saw this guy jumping over, and they were very inconsistent. Some people said he was very well dressed, like a gentleman. Some people said he just had a helmet, was like half naked, and looked like a monster. Completely inconsistent. But you have the point where everyone starts seeing this after a while, and it gets reported, and people take it very seriously. So like, you do have some comparisons and stuff like that.
Yeah, I do think that hysteria is like a real phenomenon that occurs to people when when an idea spreads. I think that weird stuff can happen. I'm sure that there wasn't actually like a fire-breathing man who could leap 9 feet in the air or whatever.
I would presume probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some historians think there might have been an original attack with something with embellished elements, and then
sure,
people added it. We don't know, but I agree that the later accounts definitely are not.
And that's actually kind of how I view the miracle of the sun as well. Is I do think that there was some kind of initial event. Like I do think that it probably was a cloudy day, and I do think that there was some kind of solar event. Some people want to say that there was a UFO that like swung by or something. I'm not willing to go that far. But yeah, maybe the sun peeked out behind the clouds and there was like some kind of weird solar flare or something. I don't know. But like all of these people saw something. Like I doubt that there was nothing at all that caused this crowd to react the way that they did. I'm sure that there was something. I just know that legends grow over time, that crowds act funny, that when they whip themselves into hysteria. And so I'm just really reluctant to label this thing as definitely supernatural.
Right.
When it's,
especially when you have people who, when everyone else sees it, you want to say like, oh yeah, you don't want to feel left out. So you either say that you saw it when you didn't, or you convince yourself that you can if you squint hard enough, right? Where you like, I think I did, or you remember it that way. There's an interesting parallel with, and this is a third hand account. So I don't know how like accurate this is historically, but it's an interesting story where Joseph Smith, this was accounted to by the governor of Illinois at the time, where he says that he saw Joseph Smith with a lot of the LDS members gathered, and he had a box, and he told them the golden plates were in it, right? And he opens it up, and they look, and they say, "Brother Joseph, we don't see any plates." And Joseph reprimands them and says, "Oh, brethren, ye of little faith, get on your knees and repent." And they do this for an hour or so, constantly praying and begging. And when he opens up again, they now can see the plates, and there's nothing there. And they convince themselves they can see it after praying really hard and keep building up the faith. Let's say that's how they saw the angel as well. And they were out there praying really hard, wanting to see it. So you could say that's something similar to Fatima, where people were really excited about seeing a miracle and convinced themselves they didn't want to walk away disappointed. So of course, and when one person sees it, oh, well, clearly there is one now, and we can't all be wrong. So it's scary what the mind can do.
It is, yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, here's your slides back up there, Kevin. And Caleb, just very, very quickly, because I don't want to. I know we still got more slides with Kevin. Do you think that psychological phenomena can explain all of the different types of appearances, or just some of them, or
in Fatima, or you mean in general?
Okay, well, yeah. Let me ask this: do you think the Marian apparitions are analogous to the resurrection appearances, or is there some fundamental difference that would make them,
well, it depends on how many facts you want to grant, right? If you're having a very minimalist approach, I think you can draw a pretty strong analogy. If you want to add in the empty tomb, which adds like a physical component, if you want to add in opponents like Paul seeing it, if you want to add in more of the physical aspects that contrary to expectation, I think then you can start breaking down those analogies. But a lot of those are going to be contested, right, in terms of what people will grant and won't grant. So that's a way. But I generally just don't like talking about psychological explanations. I think there's so little we know about human psychology to say people definitely would have thought this at the time or wouldn't have come to this conclusion. It's like we really can't know that even with people today. And so putting that on to people 2,000 years ago is really, really difficult. So I think we just have to sort of say that there's possible explanations, but we can't really find one that's plausible. But yeah, I do think that in general, most of these can be explained psychologically, which is why I like Zaytun. And I know Zaytun's not a Catholic one, so we didn't talk about it. But I think Zaytun breaks most of these tropes because from the I would say from the 17th century, or sorry, 18th century onward, right, where you have the bulk of these. The trope that Kevin pointed out is people have these secrets, and usually it's children in most of these cases, right, who see it. 1 or 2 or 3 young children. That's how it is in Medjugorje. That's how it is in Bahrain. That's how it is in what is it? The one in Africa that I'm blanking on. But there's a lot of cases where it's kids seeing this, and it's a very similar pattern. But Zaytun's different because you have adults seeing this, and it's something that's clearly captured on camera. So there's at least something objective there, and it's something that's seen by multiple people. It's not just the one small group who's the in group, and everyone else just sees them having this vision. It's something that hundreds of thousands of people actually can claim to see, and it happens repeatedly. It's not a one-time event like the miracle of the sun. It happens on occasion. People keep coming back, and it's consistently happening, and it's seen by skeptics, and there's healings associated with it. So to me, Zaytun is sort of like the ultimate Marian apparition, and surprisingly, it also doesn't have like a strict message associated with it. Our Lady of Zaytun never really says anything during this. You could debate that she said something to people before it happened, like in dreams and stuff that predicted it, but the actual event, no message was explicitly given, whereas with most of these, someone is given the secret or whatever it is. So
Not
I think
knock,
it's interesting. Yeah, knock is probably the closest analogy to Zaytun, because knock is also involving lights on top of a building that happens in a weird way. But knock was a one-time event, as far as I know, right? So Zaytun is that, but repeatedly. So I think that makes it more interesting. But knock is a good analogy, though, for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Kevin about Zaytun after. I know he hasn't done in-depth research, but just for right now, I want you to finish the Fatima. But same question to you as to Caleb. Do you think that the Marian apparitions, whatever is explaining this phenomena, is directly analogous with the resurrection appearances, or do you see that there's a fundamental difference on those? Or
is anything directly analogous to anything else? I mean, I don't know. Are there analogies that we can make? Yeah, of course. So honestly, what I will say is that I think that and I'm going to make everybody mad with this one. But I think that Fatima is better attested to than the resurrection.
I don't think that's in dispute. I mean, well, attested to is different than like maybe evidentially compelling, sure. But in terms of just primary documents, like most things from the 20th century can be more attested to, but then Fatima is better attested to than the existence of Julius Caesar. That doesn't mean that it's not for the existence of Julius Caesar, but Fatima is better attested to than the fall of Rome. But like that doesn't really say that much, because you're talking about 20th century documents where most people were literate and had a printing press, and newspapers were published the next day. Versus we have a creed that was maybe 3 years later, and we don't know the date or time exactly. But what's good evidence is contingent on the time period. You can have good evidence.
No,
time.
So I disagree, and this is maybe where we could actually, maybe this is where we can actually give the audience what they've been hoping. I'm just kidding, but I don't think that evidence is better or worse depending on the time frame that it comes from. I think that some time periods just have really awful evidence for everything in them, and that's all the worse for that time period, frankly. Like if that means that we just have to lower our credence in absolutely everything that occurred in the first century, then all the worse for the first century. Like, sorry, first century, sucks to be you.
Sure. Okay, that's probably true. I mean, that's true. It also depends on what the claim is, right? Like, I think you would agree that mundane claims that we can verify with archaeology, like how most of the stuff Josephus says we can't directly verify, but it's consistent. So it's like, yeah, maybe that's right. But it's also nothing that's super out of the ordinary in terms of, Josephus says Herod executed this one person, and it's like, oh, well, that person lived the same time. And so it could have had, it's plausible. There's nothing that's like contradicts it. So why not? It's one of those inferences.
Yeah. Like I'm more certain that there was a guy named Nero who was the emperor of Rome. I'm more certain of that than I am of, you know, Our Lady of Fatima like being an authentic Marian apparition. Sure.
Well, no, authentic though. I'm saying, are you more confident that Nero was the emperor of Rome, or that there were children who were claiming that Our Lady appeared to them, and there were people who were claiming the miracle of the sun?
I am more confident. Yeah. I am more confident that there were children in 1917 who claimed that.
Correct. Right.
I'm more confident in that than I am confident in that there was an emperor of Rome named Nero.
Yeah, of course you would, because we have better source. I mean, we still have. I think the source we have for Nero are more than sufficient. Obviously, I think anyone who says that Nero was an emperor would be insane. But because I think the evidence is more than strong enough. But I agree, because we have evidence from the next day, like contemporary, like firsthand, plenty of witness testimony that at least something happened. Like if someone just said none of this happened at all, I think that would be completely asinine.
Yeah, but my whole point here is kind of like, when it comes to the first century, the kind of evidence that we have is just not good.
Mm-hmm.
Like getting a direct quote from anybody about anything from the first century, unless they wrote it down themselves, it's probably not a direct quote. Like just
right. Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I mean, obviously, again, that's to be expected. Anything prior to the invention of the printing press is just going to sort of prima facie probably have worse evidence in that way. But I mean, I think that's also sort of, to me, the point of why people who are Christians, or at least open to this, should have a very open view of miracles and continuationism. Because I think you could make the point, like, you know, did Mary, let's say, presume I was Catholic for a second, right? And which I'm not. But how on earth historically could we prove the Marian dogmas? What historical evidence do we have? Really good historical evidence that Mary was assumed into heaven or was immaculately conceived? Like very, very little, very bad evidence historically, right? If we're just going purely off of documentation. But if you do believe that Mary herself can occasionally appear to people and clarify, hey guys, I'm the Immaculate Conception, then yeah, I think that would be more persuasive to me than documents that are really old. So it's like, I think that one can be agnostic on some of the miracles perhaps in the Bible if they're looking at it on a purely historical ground. But I do think that if there are a lot of miracles within the Christian context that are meant to vindicate that, then we should apply that retroactively to say, well, now I'm more open to this in hindsight, right? And that's exactly what they do in the Bible, because in Acts, yes, they tell people about the resurrection, but they're also healing people and raising people from the dead, according to Acts. So people took what they said a lot more seriously, right? So I can understand that if that's the principle they're going off of.
Yeah, Alpha Centaurian made a comment that is apropos to what we're discussing. So I just did a video on the Phoenix in early Christian writing, and it's really funny to read. So in the first Clementine epistle to the Romans, Clement mentions something about how those gosh darn pagans, they're giving us such a hard time when we tell them that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that we're all going to rise from the dead one day. And they believe, as everyone does, in the Phoenix, because we all know the Phoenix is real. And it's really funny. Clement's exact words are something like, we know the Phoenix by common report and by the authorities of the writings. No, sorry, that's not Clement. That was what St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan in the 4th century, wrote. And but the authority of the writings is probably referring to Clement, as well as pagan writers like Tertullian mentions the Phoenix. Josephus mentions the Phoenix. But I think it's St. Ambrose in the 4th century who writes about how if you go to Heliopolis in Egypt, literally anybody in Heliopolis can tell you about the Phoenix, because every 500 years when the Phoenix dies, it builds itself a little coffin of incense and myrrh and it dies. But then from its guts, a worm crawls out, it grows into the new Phoenix, and then it carries its bones from Arabia, where it lives as an adult, to Heliopolis, where it spends its childhood. And the priests at the Temple of the Phoenix in Heliopolis record the date that the Phoenix arrives with the bones of its parent or itself or whatever. And it is always 500 years to the day the Phoenix returns. And literally anybody in Heliopolis can tell you this. So you have this like city full of people where they're all like, yeah, like the Phoenix comes here. Like we all know that. And like and they have records of it. So like And I don't know about you. I don't think that
I think that
Phoenix...
one of the Roman emperors allegedly had a pet phoenix. I think Tacitus
Did he?
mentioned that. I forget if it was Trajan, like had a. I think he implies that he thinks it was like an eagle that was dressed up or something. Like there was actually a I forget what the god's name was, but there was some. I think it was it Pliny? Maybe one of the Plinies. No, maybe it was Lucian. I forget. But anyway, there was one who was. He's sort of like. I remember someone calling him the ancient version of James Randi, where he's kind of a debunker. And he mentions there was this one god that was a snake god that talked to people. So you'd go in and pay the oracle, and it would tell you your future, right? And what he basically said it was a trained snake that had a mask and a puppet mouth, and there were people behind it who were moving it and ventriloquism. But people had attested this. There are coins that have this image of this snake god on it. But it was kind of cool. But like you have things like that, right? So, but you saying that makes me think of like, could someone draw an analogy where Paul says there were 500 witnesses and most of them are still alive? You could talk to them today. It's not like, oh, how many people witnessed the Phoenix? You could go talk. They're still alive today. Just go to Hierapolis and see them for yourself, right? So, it is. I agree. It makes it hard. But I think if I were a skeptic, you might hammer this point home that. Do you think that if Fatima had happened, let's say, in the 1st century, which could happen, these girls saw some goddess or whatever, let's say, and people looked up and saw things in the sun, and this was recorded, let's say, maybe a decade later or so, do you think that it would be more impressive in the details and it would be harder to debunk in terms of you maybe wouldn't have the details about people not seeing it, all this stuff? It would be a very fantastic story. And I guess the point I'm trying to say is, do you think the fact that this happened in the 20th century where there's a little bit more skepticism and better ways to investigate it is why we have all these sort of negative aspects of it? And if it was something that happened way earlier in history, we wouldn't be able to find these problems with it that we do maybe now. Same with Mormonism in the same way, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think that there's just a lot less evidence for things in the 1st century. There's a lot less evidence for anything before the 16th century, frankly.
Right.
And that's a double-edged sword because there's less evidence for it, but there's also no evidence against it, So it's kind of like, so,
right.
You win some, you lose some.
Yeah. But according to you, though, if you think we have a track record of when we do investigate the ones that are better documented and they come up short or they have problems with it, the ones that you can't investigate that are less documented, you might be like, well, the probability seems to weigh against it given what we have, right?
Yeah. So I have actually thought about this before. Is there, a lot of Christian apologists will talk about a cumulative case for the existence of God or something like that, or a cumulative case for Christianity. And I have spent a little bit of time thinking is there a cumulative case against supernaturalism or something? And I'm not sure that I feel that bold, but something that I might be bold enough to say is that I think that there's something to be made of a cumulative case against Marian apparitions, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because every time that we look into a Marian apparition, it's just real suspect and stuff like that. So I kind of have this attitude now of so for instance, Our Lady of Akita is an apparition that I really haven't done a whole lot of reading about.
Is that the one that the bleeding statue in Japan?
Yes.
Yeah. Which has a lot of really impressive claims that sound good, or it's sometimes it's hard to find primary sources on it. But
yes, yeah. But I haven't looked into Akita a whole lot. Maybe I will one day if I want to do a video on it, do a real deep dive. But my posture towards Akita right now is kind of I just don't believe it, because I have looked a lot into other Marian apparitions and I've come away
and bleeding crying statues as well. There's been a lot of faked instances of those. So that's in theory, could it be different? Sure, but it's your credence is going to be kind of low. So I think that's fair. But what's interesting to me is and as much as I've been on your side on this most of this stream, I do, and as much as I'm a Protestant, I do have a soft spot for these, because I think that one thing that does impress me about them, whether you think the actual details of the case themselves aren't that persuasive, is that the power they have even evangelistically is really impressive. And I think one of the weird strengths that Christianity has is that it has an ability to flourish in places that are otherwise either hostile or mostly non-Christian, right? Because typically miracle claims originate in places that are generally very hospitable to it. Most claims of Hindu miracles come from India by people who are already Hindus, who already believe in the stuff and already prone to believe, right? But the major Marian apparition, I can't speak for all of them, but most of the major ones that you see, like Lourdes, happened at the height of, this was right after the French Revolution, when the rationalists were in power and there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, and they were very much not happy about her doing this. Originally, she was persecuted. Fatima happened when Portugal was under communist control and the Catholics did not have that much power. Medjugorje happened when in Yugoslavia, which was I think it was Yugoslavia, which was a communist country that was not very prone to religion. Zaytun happened in Egypt, which was mostly Muslim dominated and was persecuting the Coptics at the time. And yet these places now, although they're still pretty secular, are major pilgrimage sites. And countries that are, again, not overly Catholic themselves, or at least nominally Catholic in Portugal's case. But it's kind of funny that like you have these outliers of these big pilgrimage sites, these Catholic blips in otherwise relatively non-Catholic, or at least non-traditional Catholic areas. And so it's like they've been able to survive that. So that's added to my theory that I see, where I sort of see these as being ways to reignite Christianity. Maybe simplicator, because I see this in Pentecostalism as well. So I don't think it's exclusive to Catholicism, but I think that Christianity is one of the only religions that I'm aware of where you can have major population conversions based on miracle claims from people who like were not otherwise Christian. Even with Guadalupe, which, as we said, has a lot of historical problems. From the numbers I've seen, I think in 40 years or so, close to 10 million or so of the mestizo people converted to Catholicism. Now, how much of that was, forced versus other stuff, it's hard to tell. But that's how most of the tradition goes. That the story of this, at least, people saw the tilma and believed this was true, converted millions of people. And so I think that these have been very useful apologetic tools, and these have helped Catholicism survive time periods where they were being very persecuted and where it was likely that it would have burned out in relevancy. So I sort of see these as a Christian, as God preserving Christianity in these regions, or even converting people. And I don't think he cares which denomination it is. And I think actually he works with what sort of is the historical aspect to it. So France already had a Catholic background, so it would be easier to reignite Christianity with a Catholic understanding than to reintroduce a whole new denomination into that aspect, right? Same with Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism has a lot of ways to sort of resonate with a lot of the African tribal religions in Asia as well. So that's why it's been very popular in the third world. So I think Christianity's ability to adapt to those beliefs is very helpful. So that's my general understanding. I don't know what Dale thinks of that, but that's how I would account for these as a Protestant. Whether or not I think it's actually Mary, I do think that if it did have some kind of providential divine turn, it was to make Christianity look better, and was successful in that regard.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting thing, kind of thing. But yeah, Kevin, I know you've got 3 slides left, kind of thing. So I will let you back to you to finish your Fatima case, I promise. So yeah,
cool. One quick thing I'll add is like the idea of one thing being easier for God than another thing is a little funny to me. Like, I don't know if it's going to be easier for God to rekindle Christianity using Catholicism than it would be for him to be using Pentecostalism or Jim Bob's Second Reformed, Church of New England or whatever. I don't know. All things seem like they should be equally easy for God, I guess. But I guess that's neither here nor there.
Well, just to clarify, it was more so about people being receptive to it, right? Like even in Christianity, in Acts, where Paul looks at the idol to the unknown God, and he's like, "Oh, your God does this. Well, here's our," and he tries to make parallels. And when he talks to the Jews, he references the Old Testament. They'd understand Jesus is the Messiah, right? And when Justin Martyr talks about it, he talks about how Jesus is kind of like the pagan gods, where it's like, "Oh, there's some resurrections in these stories and stuff too. So we're not all that different from you guys. Like there is some overlap there, and it's meant to make Christianity, I think, more appealing and more digestible to people who have a certain understanding of God, than to have this completely alien idea that people wouldn't really buy."
No, yeah, First Apology is a great example. Yeah, I was just reading the First Apology the other day. That's Justin Martyr for the audience. One last thing that I didn't mention yet that's kind of fun about Fatima is that, so this comes from the 4th memoir, which again was written in the 1940s, but read what Lucia said Our Lady said. And so that I've just zoomed in here on that red part. So Our Lady said to Lucia in 1917, "Continue to pray the Rosary in order to obtain the end of the war. In October, our Lord will come, as well as Our Lady of Dolores, sorrows, and Our Lady of Carmel. Saint Joseph will appear with the child Jesus to bless the world. God is pleased with your sacrifices." Whatever. Wait a minute. Our Lady is appearing with Our Lady and Our Lady. is there some kind of pantheon of the Blessed Virgins? I thought when Our Lady of Fatima showed up, Our Lady of Mount Carmel was already right there, and Our Lady of Dolores, and Our Lady of Knock and Guadalupe, and all of them, because they're all the same person, no? So why is Our Lady of Fatima telling Lucia that I'm going to show up, and so is Our Lady of Mount Carmel? Wait, hold on. Wait, Mount Carmel? That was the first one we did, the second one we did. It's all modern historians agree that Our Lady of Mount Carmel was not a historical event. So Our Lady of Fatima is telling Lucia that she's going to appear alongside the mythical version of herself. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to have that pop up.
It's like the Trinity of Marys.
Right. Like, this seems kind of problematic to me. This is another reason why I do think that Lucia was full of it. Like, I think that it's good to separate the miracle of the sun from the apparition itself, because I am of the opinion that there was some kind of solar phenomenon that day, at least one that was enough to inspire some people in the crowd, and then some people in the crowd inspired everybody else in the crowd, and there was this mass hysteria, and then people thought that, but I do think that there was some initial event that actually caused something to happen. That seems like it's like kind of the most obvious answer is that, yeah, something did happen. Yeah, Scott, great point. Folk Catholicism is folk, it's pagan almost. But I just thought that this was really interesting, and it kind of ties, we're going all the way back to the beginning. We're going to 2.5 hours ago or whatever. 3 hours ago, oh my gosh. But Our Lady of Fatima says to Lucia that she will appear with Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So I'm happy to admit that something did happen at the Cova in Portugal in 1917. I just think that Lucia herself is untrustworthy, and that whatever happened, it was some kind of solar event, not a Marian event. I have 2 videos on Fatima. If you're going to watch the first, please watch the second, because I make some critical mistakes in my first video that I don't correct until the second video. And I think that's the whole presentation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just in conclusion, the earliest Marian apparitions that we spoke about today have really shaky historicity, almost as if the Marian apparition trend was something that wasn't present in apostolic Christianity, and only became popular starting a millennium after Christianity began. We didn't even talk about Our Lady of the Pillar. First mention of that is in the 11th century or something like that, but supposedly it's from the year 40. Okay. The later Marian apparitions seem to have untrustworthy seers. So we can talk about Maximin and Melanie, who had troubled lives and were not even canonized. We could talk about Lucia, who seemed to be adding stuff after the fact and making prophecies after the fact and stuff like that. And then we have Bernadette too, who maybe she was sincere, but she seemed to have weird. There was weird stuff about her, and she always referred to Our Lady as a Caro and all that. All of these stories, the old ones and the modern ones, all seem to have legendary attributes. As in, these are stories that over time, they seem to become grander the more time goes on. And these stories have all developed cult followings. Whenever the miracle stuff is tested, results are always disappointing. I'm thinking in particular here of the Tilma of Guadalupe. It really doesn't seem to hold up to the claims that are made about it. Some of them are quite silly. For all of these reasons, I think that a general skepticism of Marian apparitions is warranted. I think that that's fair. You can kind of consider this to be something of a cumulative case against Marian apparitions. Thank you for being with me for 3 hours, Elphine.
Do you think that, and so another point I would just have added as well that I don't know if you mentioned, is that I think that the fact that the description of Mary is sort of inconsistent among all of these. Now, some people see that. I've heard Catholic apologists argue that that's intentional to make it work with the culture, but when she appears in Lourdes and Fatima, others, she's a white young lady, and Guadalupe, she's mestizo. Sometimes she's wearing a crown and a white and a golden sash. Sometimes she's just wearing white. Sometimes in I forget where it was in Africa. She was African American, or not African American. She was black, but you get the point. Her race and what she's wearing all changes depending on who she's appearing to. Now, you could say maybe that's because she wants to adapt to the culture and be recognizable. On the other hand, you could also say maybe people with that cultural aspect of seeing the Virgin Mary, of what she traditionally looks like, are projecting that onto what they see. And that's why they do it. Interesting enough, though, and I'll argue this probably in a future volume of the book, I think with Christic apparitions, the Christophanies of Jesus, generally speaking, they're much more consistent across cultures, which is really interesting. And I sort of see Marian apparitions as like the control group to sort of compare the two. But that's for another show.
Yeah, no. So growing up, I was always told that Our Lady appears to people in the way that she's going to be best received. And so that's why she's mestizo and she appears in Guadalupe in 1531 and why she's white in Portugal in 1917. I bought it at the time. Today, I look at that and I'm like, well, that's convenient, isn't it?
It's the same thing with alien abductions, right? The people in the West typically see them as these like gray aliens that you've seen in like, what's the place in Roswell, like those depictions. In South America, they look more like hairy monsters. In Europe, they look more just like humanoids. And I think other places look more like lizard creatures. So one theory is that there are different species of aliens abducting different races of people. Another theory is that different races of people and ethnicities project and have certain cultural understandings that happen to preclude what they end up seeing when they think that they've been abducted. I think the second option is a lot more plausible, personally, but
me too. And I think that applies to Marian apparitions. I think there's a lot of I think that there's a lot of similarities between Marian apparitions and UFO phenomena, to the point where there are PhDs like Dr. Diana Pasulka, who writes about the similarities between Marian apparitions and UFOs. And it's pretty much like World War II is this dividing line, and the Marian apparition of pre-World War II became the alien abduction of post-World War II. And like what happened in World War II, we started creating like fighter jets and stuff like that. So like it's not shocking that like the cultural thing became UFO instead of Marian apparitions. But yeah, it's interesting.
All right. So I'm kind of interested, Kevin. I know you haven't studied this because you've concentrated on Catholic Marian apparitions, but I know Caleb has done research into these other things, like with the Coptics and the Zetuan thing in Egypt. I'm just kind of curious. Do you have a educated guess as to what would explain something like that, given your research in Catholic Marian apparitions, or do you see that as a totally different thing?
So I know very little about it. It's just like prima facie, I guess. It seems like if it is going to come in second to any apparition, it would only come in second to Fatima. And that's like if there's a huge if, and I say that because of like the crowd sizes. Like apparitions like La Salette, where only 2 people saw it, I feel like are relatively easy to be like, that's just 2 people, who really cares. But Zaytun, I mean, it's like tens of thousands of people saw it, right?
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Some people say 1 million, like over the course of 3 years, but it was at least hundreds of thousands.
Okay, so yeah, hundreds of thousands. I feel like that's really
hard.
Including
the president of Egypt at the time, and like a lot of other authorities, including journalists from Western universities who were visiting at the time and stuff. So
yeah, that certainly seems like it deserves the #1 spot. And again, I'm not well researched. I don't know much about Zaytun at all. People like a lot of Catholics will ask me to look into it. I think that they ask me to look into it because they think it's going to convince me that like there's merit to all this stuff. And my response is always, you need to go find an ex-Orthodox person, some like ex-Coptic, to go look into that. Because I just, if I did look into that, what would happen? I would become Orthodox. Like, oh,
you just know deep down they're seething. It's like, dang it, why couldn't we have the cool one? Which was like the coolest one. It's like it was the Orthodox who we don't like to have to do that one. So
I know. So whenever like a Catholic tells me to look into Zaytun, I'm like, I don't think you actually want me to. Like
do you? Like, what do I?
Yeah, I'm always like, I can't. Like you're batting for the other team right now, but okay, like I'll look into it if you want.
Yeah.
Why do you guys say Orthodox? Isn't it Coptic? That's different than Orthodox.
It's Coptic Orthodox, which is a kind. I mean, Eastern Orthodox is like a whole umbrella of like very niche subsets within it. But
Gotcha.
for the record, just for context, Zaytun is historically among the Coptic Orthodox the region where they believe that, you know how in Matthew where they're fleeing Egypt and they go to, oh, sorry, they're fleeing Herod and they go to Egypt for a few years. They believe that there's a particular location where Mary rested in Egypt, and that's where they were like living for a while, and that's the general area where this happened. So that's the historical significance they assign to it. It's not just some random place in Egypt.
Interesting. Okay. And that was established according to tradition before this event.
Oh, the tradition was established well before. I don't know. I don't think the tradition's like well attested historically. Like, I have no idea when that tradition started. It probably wasn't like until at least hundreds of years after, you know, Jesus rose from the dead or something. If I'm being generous, I'm sure it was probably later than that. But yes, that was that belief was probably there for, I don't know, about at least a century or a couple of centuries before the apparitions, as far as I know.
Maybe like a millennium even before.
Yeah, maybe being just probably millennium, but that millennium would still be 1,000 years removed from the original event. But yeah,
sure, yeah.
I would really be interested to see Kevin look into that. I know it's not his usual shtick, but who cares? I just would be interested to see what your take is, because I'm skeptical of it too. There's something about it. Like when I hear it, it's like when I look at it. First of all, I don't. Yeah, if you squint real hard, oh yeah, that's Mary, right? But you have to be talked into it. Like if I was never told what that was and just like look at what this is, I don't see Mary. I can see maybe a humanoid like statue type figure. It looks like a statue to me at best. And
he says that, but I've shown the pictures out of context to people and said, "What do you think this is?" Is that it kind of looks like a relic of Mary or something? And it's like, oh, well, wouldn't you like to know where it came from or something? But of course, it's the traditional depiction. Obviously, we don't know what Mary looked like, and you can't see any details in the face. I mean, that's obviously granted, but I don't know. There's some photos of her allegedly, you know, praying. That's the most well-known one. There's some where she's sitting and holding Jesus apparently, and is covered in incense. There's a lot of weird, and then there's some that just look like balls of light. There's some that look like doves. It's just like a weird amalgamation of it. But yeah, I'd start with Jimmy Akin's video, Kevin, and go there. There's only one real like skeptical, relatively thorough skeptical response, and it's gotten a lot of criticism. And I don't think it's very persuasive for multiple reasons. And all the other skeptical responses I see, they sort of just explain the secondary details, but not the main ones. They're like, okay, well, here's why people thought it was Mary because of social contagion. But they don't try to actually explain like with a lie. They're just like, it was just some weird unknown light UFO-wise that we just don't know. And I guess you could always say that, but they're sort of admitting that there's a part of this that is genuinely unexplained in that way. But
there's like Knock, there's no message, right? That's Zaytun.
Yeah, I mean, there was one before the church was built in the 1920s. There was a businessman who was going to build a hotel at the spot, and he had a dream where the Virgin Mary said, "No, don't build a hotel there. Build a chapel to me, and I'll do a miracle there eventually." And so he does that, and then 40 years later is when the miracle happens. But there wasn't a message at the time when it was happening.
Okay.
So you could say maybe that was the message, but it wasn't like the secrets. So that's why I say I think it's a lot different than the typical Catholic model, which is why I think it's more interesting as well, because it's not like little children singing it. It's not some secrets being held. So,
Yeah.
it just, yeah, there's just some, I don't know. I suspect, I can't prove how, and there's counter-arguments against it, but I think if anything, there's something fraudulent going on with it. That's just my...
At Zaytun specifically?
I think so.
I think that's a better explanation than some of the natural ones I've seen, because it's like when you hear the description, it seems implausible to think that the only natural description I've really seen is that there was a paper published in the 80s by some actually no, I don't think they were geologists. It was a geology journal though, where it said that maybe it had been earthquake lights, because they said if you look at earthquakes around the time of around that time within a 400-mile radius, they could be caused by earthquake lights. And that was criticized, one, because earthquake lights are already sort of contested. We don't really know if they're really a thing or if it's sort of like lightning or like they destroy electrical systems and that's what it is. Like there's no real mechanism that we even know of to say that these are a thing that is generated by them. But even if we granted by that, there's no analogy to saying that these are the same lights that appear on top of the same building consistently for 3 years, right? Again, these earthquakes are within a 400-mile radius. So that's like if there were earthquakes all throughout Louisville and you were seeing them at the same building in Chicago every single time it seems really implausible to think that it would like work out that way, right? And they're also not like super directed where you can find like the busiest time of these apparitions was when there weren't any earthquakes. So that's why I say it's not. I don't think it's very plausible like at all. I think the fraud one's better, but I think the details of the fraud in that case are not plausible because they shut down all the power in many cases. They had a whole team investigate, couldn't find any kind of projector. I think the only thing you could say is maybe the church itself, the government, faked this whole thing, and the investigation was also conspiracy. But I don't like positing like multiple people being in on it. I think that's kind of ad hoc and unfalsifiable. So you could say
there
that.
Been an independent power generator or something like there could be other explanations.
They searched they searched within a 15-mile radius and couldn't find any projector. And again, this was in the 60s, so the projection equipment they would have had would have been relatively limited to what we have today.
Yeah, well, like I said, there's counters to it. It's not out of the realm, though. But yeah, I do think fraud there's some kind of deliberate effort between, this kind of occurrence showing up and for 100,000 people. But it just seems like that's not God's MO. Like he doesn't do that kind of thing.
But it also converted thousands of Muslims to Christianity. So I mean, and it also was right after the Israel-Egypt war. So I think it relieved a lot of tensions that Muslims and Jews and Christians had among each other. So I think that there are definitely fruits you can see that come from it. At least for me.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, like, well, Jesus doesn't appear to like everybody in Jerusalem, kind of thing. Like it just seems to go against the way. I don't know. Like that's just kind of a theological thing. It seems like it's not his MO to be so upfront and just like, yeah, 100,000. Here I am. I'm real. Kind of thing. Like,
well, it's interesting though. But wouldn't you be equally skeptical of the one? Like, do you think it's more plausible that Mary or Jesus or whoever would appear to like a handful of kids, and then we should take it on their testimony by faith, just like the disciples did, and like that's like the evidence is that we have these kids' testimonies. Like, I don't even know if you see that because in Acts, although it's true that people, I mean, put aside the 500 for a second. Even if we grant the disciples and Paul are the only ones who really see Jesus and Mary, and the other handful of ones who did, the miracles that confirmed them, like the healings and all this stuff, were very public, and that's made pretty clear in Acts. Where thousands of people see these and convert, right? Even if Jesus himself doesn't appear. So I don't really know if that distinction is that relevant. It's like, well, Jesus himself didn't appear to all these people, but yet he was still vindicating them through miracles to crowds of people in public. So I don't really know where that line is drawn.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Kevin, any last words? You were the main guest presenting, so I'll let you have the last word if you want it.
My last word is that I'm incredibly disappointed that the three of us weren't at each other's throats tonight. No, I actually kind of figured that this would be the result going into it.
We needed Dane. He would have ripped your throat out.
You should have had someone who's a bigger defender of these. I know a couple of Catholic apologists who might have been more at your throat.
I have been asking Catholic apologists to talk about these things with me, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Trent Horn made a video on Fatima where he said it was baptized in the resurrection. I'm surprised you couldn't talk about it with him.
I have been told that I'm not big enough to talk to Trent Horn yet by Trent Horn people. So, very well. But I've reached out to a lot of non-Trent Horn Catholic apologists who have responded to me, and none of them seem super willing to talk about Marian apparitions, and all of their responses are always, well, you can reject every single Marian apparition and still be a Catholic. And my response to that is, yes, but most Catholics don't reject them. So it's worth talking about, is it not?
Plus, it at least helps your case. Like, you could, but I mean, like, wouldn't that, if they were true, wouldn't that be like really strong? Like, hey guys, like, look at this kind of thing. Like, it seems like a really useful tool if they were true.
Yeah, it's super frustrating to me that Catholics seem to only want to discuss Marian apparitions with a friendly audience. They almost never want to discuss Marian apparitions with a skeptic like me, which I find to be a tacit admission of the weakness of the evidence for Marian apparitions. And then it's only like, oh no, once I've got you, and once I've got you that the Pope is necessary for a functioning church, now we can talk Marian apparitions. And I'm like, oh, come on, like, is it not?
It's not a dogma of the church. So you can, as you said, you can direct every Marian apparition and you want it still.
And I don't know a single Catholic who does. That's my point. Marian apparitions were a huge deal for me growing up. They were a huge deal for most Catholics, except for oddly all of the Catholic converts on all of, like, for whatever reason, Protestant converts to Catholicism make up a disproportionate amount of Catholic YouTube. So I feel like when I talk to people on Catholic YouTube, I'm like, yeah, Marian Apparitions are like a huge deal in Catholicism. And they're like, what are you talking about? No, they're not. I'm like, didn't you grow up Protestant? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, there you go. Like if
Yeah,
you
it's
grew up,
probably why they're just sort of like used to not wanting that. I do think it's, and I know we're trying to wrap up here. I do think it's funny though that like a big part of the rationalism that you see with miracle claims, like with Hume's essay especially, Hume was writing to Anglicans and he uses a lot of Catholic miracles as examples. And he says, well, you all clearly don't believe any of these, and we have better attestation to this. So why do you believe testimonies from way further back that are less reliable, right? So he's kind of trying to show that inconsistency. But he was using the fact that the Protestants just rejected the Jesuits and or not Jesuits, the Janus and all the other ones that they thought were way too charismatic and way too weird. And it was like, well, look, you don't believe them, but we have eyewitness accounts of these things. And so I think that's an interesting way to sort of pit it, that there's a lot of bias. Dale Allison in his book on the resurrection has a good quote from, I forget who it is. It's from some Protestant writer, I think from the 19th century, where he literally says, like, even if there was a miracle in Catholicism and everyone in Congress and the President of the United States and the Supreme Court testified under oath that they saw it, I still would not believe it because it is a religion or whatever it is. It's a papist lie or something where it's like, okay, that's a little out there.
Dale Allison is one of those people who I've loved absolutely every single podcast that I've ever listened to with him on it, and I still have not read a single Dale Allison book. Which
read his books; they're so good. At least you will like. I think you'll like Night Comes, and I think you'll like his Resurrection book. Those are his.
Yeah,
I know I will because I love the way he talks, which means that I think I'm gonna like the way that he writes too. I'm just a bad Dale Allison fan.
Dale Allison will also make everyone uncomfortable because he likes to be like, Christians, here's some stuff we don't know. We should be he does the parallels, but it doesn't make either side comfortable. Like he does Zaitun as a parallel to the resurrection. He's like, we know way more about this than we do anything with the resurrection. And yet I don't think Mary really appeared to these people, but what does that mean for the resurrection? And skeptics, how do we make sense of this? I don't think we can just dismiss it either. So like you might point to this and say, see, you can't believe in the resurrection, but how do you explain it, right? And he does stuff in Buddhism and all this. So it's just, I think he just likes to sort of be like, any side you want, we just don't know what to think. So let's just be agnostic. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. I want to say thank you so much to my great guests, Caleb Jackson and obviously Kevin, doing the majority of the hard work in this episode with the slides and everything. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on that front. I think this was an important topic. Marian Apparitions is really important to look into because it is presented as evidence for specifically Catholic views, but even Orthodox people will use it, or other people will use it for their own type thing. So yeah, thank you guys for coming on to discuss that. And so tomorrow night at 7:00, I have a show as a joint show with Faith Unaltered with Dr. Emily Curtis, and she's wrote a book called Hope in the Morning. So she's kind of an expert on dealing with grief and losing people, and how do we mourn as Christians? What's the proper way to do that? So that's part of our series. Tyler wanted to focus on shows that were less doctrinal in notion, but more practical Christian living. So this is one of those shows. So enjoy that, and I'll see you guys tomorrow night.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. All right, I've hit the